the craziest cave rescue missions ever. If you're anything like me, then you guys have spent a lot of time at 2 a.m. watching YouTube. And for some reason, we all end up in the same rabbit hole, watching those insane caving videos. You know, the guys with loving families at home who just decide that they need to shove themselves through 2-inch cracks, 100 feet under the ground, while half underwater and covered in spiders. And at this point, it's even a meme to make fun of these crazy cave people. All over TikTok, people are just putting shoes over cracks and being like, oh, look at me, I'm a caver, which is honestly hilarious. But in this video, we're going deep. No pun intended. Today, we are discussing rescue missions, but I'm putting a twist on this video. These rescue missions could either be successful or unsuccessful, and you won't know the outcome until the end of the story. So buckle up and don't get too attached to the characters in these stories. Let's begin. Thunder Canyon. This story gets seriously intense and involves a software engineer who went on a cave expedition with an experienced group and ended up fighting for his life. Brent Colvin is a 39-year-old software engineer from Valley Center, California. And due to the fact that he was an engineer, he was a very meticulous planner, especially when it came to planning unique adventures. And his trip to Thunder Canyon was no different. It's important to note that Brent is not an unexperienced caver and has been caving for years and is considered by many an intermediate to advanced caver. And the group of cavers he was about to embark on this expedition on were even more experienced than him. Thunder Canyon is a legendary cave for a few reasons. For starters, it's extremely elusive and is not marked anywhere, and it's only known within the caving community. And even learning the coordinates or general location of this cave system is more or less of a privilege. That aura for a lot of cavers already is so enticing, but it doesn't end there. The cave itself is dynamic. It's deep, dark, open in some places, wet in some places, tight in some places, and it almost sounds like I'm not describing a cave, but trust me, I am. Personally, it's hard to imagine a cave seeming enticing. However, if caving is your thing, Thunder Canyon had everything you wanted. It was rare, unique, and there was also many ways to approach it, as there was multiple entrances and exits that have been mapped out by other cavers. On Sunday, May 3rd, 2010, Brian and 6 other experienced cavers found themselves en route to Thunder Canyon, which included a short drive down an abandoned dirt road, and then from there a 2-mile hike to even get close to one of the elusive entrances to Thunder Canyon. After doing some searching, they find one of the entrances at 11 a.m. and the excursion begins. Upon entering this cave, they descend, and shortly after, without a hitch, the entire team clears the first obstacle. However, after this first rappel was a much larger task. It was an 80-foot drop. Now, it's important to note that this isn't just a rappel either. This rappel is a descent into darkness, going through a literal underground waterfall that lands you into a underground puddle of almost freezing cold water. But for cavers, this is all part of the thrill. The guide, Luca, is the first to rappel, and shortly after, the other cavers rappel as well, until they are all safely at their first checkpoint. At this point, it was obvious that some of the cavers were already feeling the pressure of what this cave was about to bring, and the guide even gave everybody an out, saying it's only going to get worse from here, and if you want to get out now. There was about to be tight squeezes, it's only going to get colder, and the trip has just begun. But even with some unsure faces, everybody continued on the journey. After completing a few rooms and rappelling twice more, the group meets their first fissure, aka one of these claustrophobic holes, which was literally named the Terrible Traverse. And it's called that because it takes a right angle into a 9-inch wide crack. A gap so tight that you can't even turn your head. And not only is it tight, the gap is also deep. 200 feet deep from top to bottom. It's important to note that the group reached this fissure at 3 p.m., 4 hours into their caving journey. And this fissure was one of the last things standing in their way before they were at the exit of the planned route. And it was, of course, at this fissure where everything was going to take a terrible turn. The guide of this expedition goes through this crack first, without a hitch. He's done it many times. Next up, one of the least experienced cavers goes through this gap, and he, unfortunately, gets stuck. And not only does he get stuck, but he panics. He had never been pinned like this before and was freaking out, and none of the other cavers were going to be able to help him until he calmed down. However, within 5 minutes, the guide was able to calm him down, and within 10 minutes, the guide and the other cavers were able to pull him through and assist him out of the cave. After that slight hiccup, 3 other cavers in your party make it through this fissure, and it's at that point when the guide takes all of the other cavers out of the group, leaving Brent to cross this fissure all by himself. A reasonable decision because Brent was an experienced caver and had experience in this specific cave. However, Brent hadn't experienced the Terrible Traverse, and this experience would be one that he would never forget. It's important to note that Brent was very nervous about trying this gap, and he didn't even know that the guide had left with the other cavers. So it was simply just Brent and his final buddy behind him in the cave. Regardless, Brent began moving through the terrible traverse. One of the biggest challenges associated with this fissure is the fact that you're not just walking through a gap or crawling through a gap. You have to move feet first down the length of the crack, and then angle your body sideways to shimmy along before dropping down a 5-foot gap where you could then get your footing and squeeze through to the exit. Just to be extra cautious, Brent removed his wetsuit to ensure he had as much space as possible. However, after inserting his body fully into this fissure, he was almost instantly stuck. He could feel the tension of the rocks on his chest, his hips were wedged between the walls, and the only thing supporting his body was his hand. He couldn't move in any direction, and it was at that point when he realized he was stuck. After being stuck for what felt like an eternity, the guide returned, only to notice Brent was stuck. And after 2 hours of their best efforts, Brent was no closer to being free and was actually beginning to slip deeper and deeper down this fissure. Due to the stress of believing that he would not make it out alive, Brent became rather lucid. And the final caver behind him, James, was simply telling him stories to try to keep him awake and conscious. And it wasn't until 6:40 p.m., almost 4 hours later, that the San Bernardino Mountain Rescue Team was actually notified and mobilized to the position. After 7 hours of Brent being stuck, the guide was signaling to a rescue helicopter that was sent, as the initial rescue team that showed up was simply not equipped to help Brent. And although the helicopter spotted them and help was on the way, it took an additional 4 hours for the helicopter to find a safe place to land and the specialized team to get on site. At this point, there was a very real risk of hypothermia for Brent and compartment syndrome, which is essentially when your chest is compressed for a long period of time, exposing you to the risk of cardiac arrest. Brent dying in his stuck position was a very real situation, and was only becoming more and more likely as more time passed. Once the rescue team finally was able to reach Brent within the cave, they explained exactly how severe the situation was, and their first order of business was keeping him as warm as possible, as he had no wetsuit on and his body was trapped between two rocks that were much colder than his body temperature, essentially drawing heat out of his body. The rescuers put heat packs around Brent and even gave him an electrolyte beverage. But with Brent and the final caver, at this point hypothermic, the rescuers had to move quick to save these individuals. As the rescue team began to attempt to move Brent, it was obvious that this was going to be a painful experience, as his ribs were tightly wedged between two rocks. As they began pulling at his feet, Brent was screaming in pain, and the rescue team even asked Brent if they should stop pulling him, and it's reported that Brent literally replied, "I don't care if you break my ribs, just get me out of here." The rescuers used as much leverage as possible to lift the wooden board that bridged the gap in this fissure that was supporting Brent, and they used anchors to try to lift his body to pull him out. And with many failed attempts, they were able to move him 1, 2, 3 inches until they had him in a spot where their only option was to begin pulling his feet and essentially yanking him out of this cave. Brent's condition deteriorated deeper and deeper, and at 3:40 a.m., nearly 15 hours after entering the cave, Brent was pulled free out of the cave and rescued. After Brent was led out of the cave, the final caver quickly squeezed through the fissure without an issue, and the entire team survived this expedition. And after everything was said and done, it took over 13 people to help rescue Brent. I thought I'd start this video on a happy note. Yeah, Brent survived, fortunately. But I could not imagine what that experience would be like. And truthfully, I don't even want to paint a picture because I don't even want to imagine it. Being stuck, sideways, dark, hypothermic, and lucid has to be just awful. And believe it or not, Brent promised himself that he would continue caving after this. Although he did say he would avoid tight squeezes, so at least there's that. At least he made it. But that might not be the case for this next story. The Peruvian Intimeche Cave. Cecilio Lopez Tercero is a lifelong caver and adventure lover, and whether it be a natural talent or simply because of his lifelong experience and fascination, Cecilio had a very particular skill for navigating caves and squeezing through extremely tight gaps, seemingly with ease and almost no fear. He is a respected cave explorer, and at the time of this story, he is considered a veteran caver. Cecilio was even a member of the Madrid Rescue Group, meaning that he was more qualified than anybody, not only to save people, but also to explore caves safely. He was one of Spain's most renowned rescuers and cavers. Cecilio was Spanish, but due to his unique skills, he was taken on expeditions around the world to navigate caves that no one else would dare, and to map out caves that no one else could. I think you guys get the idea. This guy was a pro. Cecilio had heard of this obscure and rare cave system in the mountains of Peru through some of his colleagues. And when he learned that there was a potential for there to be never before seen artifacts or structures, he was instantly on board. And the expedition was set. And Cecilio and 9 of his colleagues began their expedition into the Intamache cave in the Peruvian Andes. The Intamache cave was reported to be at least a mile long and at least 1,200 feet deep. And Cecilio was curious how much deeper and longer it was and what secrets were hidden down in the bottom of this cave. Like any professional, Cecilio studied meticulously, learning of all of the risks associated with this cave. With the expedition underway, Cecilio led his group of colleagues into this cave on a multi-day expedition. And the first few days went on without any issues. Notes were taken, beautiful sights were seen, and everything was going to plan. But as they got deeper and deeper into the cave, the squeezes only got tighter, and the map only got more vague. After multiple days in this cave, the challenging physical aspect was obvious and accounted for, but the mental aspect was starting to take a toll as well, as these people at this point had been in complete darkness for days, only seeing the light of their headlamp. And the cave that they are hundreds of feet into is completely silent, only broken by the sounds of water dripping. It wasn't until what would have been one of the last days of the expedition that tragedy struck, and it was during a rappel portion of the cave. Cecilio was about to descend a modest 15 meters into the next room, known as the 13 days room. And it was at this point, after the anchor was set and he began rappelling, that he heard a cracking noise. His anchor had failed, and Cecilio was in a free fall, falling 15 meters onto hard rock. Cecilio somehow avoided all of the razor-sharp rocks covering the floor of this room. However, he lied there motionless, in extreme pain, and with a suspected broken back. After regaining consciousness, Cecilio came to the harsh reality of his situation. He lied helpless, deep in a cave that was already in an extremely remote and treacherous location, 400 miles away from Lima, Peru. He knew he needed to be rescued, but he also knew it was not going to be easy. One of Cecilio's colleagues carefully climbed down to where Cecilio was to assess the situation and realized how grim it was. One of the cavers in this party left to get help, and the others stayed with Cecilio to help monitor his health. Fortunately, Cecilio survived a fall that could have easily been fatal for some. However, now he has to survive what would likely be the most grueling days of his life, as after he fell and sustained these injuries, it would take almost a week for rescue personnel to make it to where Cecilio was. Keep in mind, Cecilio was in a deep, remote cave located on the top of a mountain, where the entrance of the cave was at over 10,000 feet in altitude. When this medical team finally was able to find the location of the cave, hike over 10,000 feet to the cave entrance, and then begin the wild journey to where Cecilio was in the bottom of this extremely advanced cave, they weren't even there to help him escape. They were simply there to provide comfort measures and assess his health. They built a makeshift base camp and began administering morphine to provide comfort to the injured man that the medical team didn't know if they'd be bringing out dead or alive. Because Cecilio was still alive, removing him was going to be an extremely complicated feat, and it couldn't simply drag him by his feet, and he, unable to feel his legs, was unable to help himself as well. The medical team brought a rigid stretcher that was specifically designed to help carefully drag Cecilio out without jolting or repositioning his body, risking injuring him even worse. With medical measures in place, it was up to the other cavers to request specialized help. And initially, the Spanish government was unwilling to send a rescue team, and then they turned to the Peruvian government, both of which who denied to send help to save Cecilio's life. Cecilio's colleagues did the only thing they could do. They reached out to the Madrid Caving Society and also turned to social media, begging for support to help save their dear friend's life. They did everything they could to pressure the Spanish government into saving one of their most valuable cavers. Now, this is where things get interesting. Once some of Cecilio's friends from back home caught news of this, they immediately flew to Peru to help save them themselves. That is real friendship. And by the time these amazing friends were on the scene, there was already a small village at this cave entrance, consisting of medical staff, rescuers, and volunteers. Don't forget, this cave entrance is extremely remote and over 10,000 feet in altitude. It's not an easy place to be. And once again, keep in mind that this cave is extremely advanced, and many of the volunteers and rescue personnel that were dispatched are simply not equipped for this level of cave. And it would be only more of a liability for them to even attempt to save Cecilio. By the time that this rescue mission was fully underway, there was volunteer cave experts from Spain, France, Mexico, Peru, and over 40 Peruvian fighter fighters and military personnel actively involved in the rescue of Cecilio. And yet, there was still major challenges that took place. These 40 people need to eat, drink, they need to communicate with others, meaning that all of the progress that they're able to make is delayed significantly due to their lack of supplies, only adding more and more complexity to this seemingly impossible rescue mission. With this global team of experts on site ready to help Cecilio, they began the exploration into into the cave. And once they reached Cecilio, they even explained their plan to him and got his professional insight on the escape that they had planned. And then they built a base camp 900 feet into the cave and began to set a complex series of anchor points across the entire cave so that they could essentially hoist the stretcher with Cecilio on it without him taking much more damage. On the 12th day, when they began drawing the stretcher out of the deep cave, things took a turn for the worse, as on this day, winds were higher than normal. The weather was unfavorable, and rain was adding an entirely new level of complexity into this rescue mission. Despite the heavy winds, a rescue helicopter was able to take the freshly rescued Cecilio to the nearest hospital, where he was treated, and after many months of treatment, he amazingly made a full recovery. The case of Cecilio Lopez is literally insane, and honestly a bit heartwarming to see how passionate people were about saving this man's life, likely because of all of the lives that Cecilio impacted during his time as a rescuer himself. If it wasn't for nearly 50 people from across the globe, not to mention local volunteers and villagers in the area, Cecilio would have never made it out of this cave and simply would have died. Call it luck or call it karma, Cecilio had something or somebody watching over him. Cecilio is a gangster, and the story is a clear example of how resilient the human body and mind can be. But we still have one more to discuss: the Chilean miner rescue. This rescue mission is by far the most intense we've talked about on this list, and is likely one of the most intense cave rescue missions ever conducted. As the title suggests, this rescue mission isn't of cavers who went down a deep, crazy, uncharted cave. This rescue mission is rescuing miners working in a gold and copper mine. And unfortunately, what started as a regular day in the job ended up becoming a multi-month global affair. Let me explain. On August 5th, 2010, 33 miners entered the San Jose cave in Chile. But that night, none of these miners leave that cave. The San Jose cave is over 100 years old and it stretches over 10 miles of confusing corridors. Some of these mine shafts go almost a mile deep into the ground. But for these miners, this was a normal day at work. And shortly after 2 a.m., a collapse had happened, leaving these miners trapped. The San Jose mine, which was owned by the San Esteban Mining Company, was known for its notoriously unsafe work conditions, and the company had reportedly even ignored warnings from the Chilean Safety Administration. And unfortunately, today was the day that what the Chilean government had warned about would happen. After hearing a huge rumbling noise and literally feeling the earth shake below them, these miners, unaware that they have just been trapped, decide that they should likely exit the cave to evaluate what just happened. And it's on their way out of the cave that these miners realize that there was collapse. And not only a small collapse, but a large collapse caused by a 45-story tall piece of diorite rock, blocking the only way in and out of the cave. This piece of diorite was almost 1,000,000 tons and fell directly onto the mine shaft. Fortunately, leaving the mine wasn't the only option for these miners, as near the very bottom of the mine was a man-made room known as the refuge. And after realizing that they weren't leaving this mine, all of the miners gathered up and made their way to the refuge. The refuge is exactly how it sounds. It's an emergency shelter area. Fresh air is strategically pumped into this room from the surface, and is also stocked with emergency food and medicine. This room was meant for this exact situation, and in this case is going to be the difference between life and death. Because the mine is so massive, men working near the very bottom of the cave still at this point were completely unaware of what happened, and one of the miners had to go down to inform them what had happened and bring them back up to the refuge. These 33 miners weren't just all mining together. They were all in different parts of the cave when this happened. However, they all survived the collapse, and it didn't take long for them to all be gathered up in the safest place in the cave. Some of the miners remembered that the ventilation system that pumps fresh air into different parts of the cave is, by regulation, supposed to be large enough to carry a person, and also should have a ladder inside for situations like this. Unfortunately, after further inspection, it was discovered that these ladders were never installed, and that these air pipes were simply useless for escape. And in their opinion, they have no way of contacting the surface, and at that point, things look grim. During this collapse, there was actually one miner who was in a part of the cave that was above where the collapse was, meaning that he was able to escape. Making his way through ash and rubble, he was able to tell the site supervisors exactly what happened and begin what would end up being a multi-month-long rescue mission. Due to the remote nature of this cave and the lack of any cell service, it took over 5 hours from the collapse happening for any authorities to even be notified of the situation. Unlike the last one, the government was willing to help these people, and they sent a specialized team down the mine shaft to see exactly what was going on. The specialized team decided to take the ventilation shafts down into the mine because they are able to rappel down and do not require a ladder. Although roughly halfway down this ventilation shaft, it is made very obvious that these ventilation shafts were unstable due to the collapse and that they would not be a method of rescue. And on their way back up, some rescuers were almost lost in another smaller collapse that took place within one of the ventilation shafts. And those on the surface still don't even know if the people in the cave are alive or not. After the miners return to the refuge with grim news about the ventilation shaft, the group of miners begin to plan for the worst. And it's at that point when they begin rationing the very small amount of supplies they have, and also begin to set out a routine, as these experienced miners understand that this rescue, if at all possible, will not take days, but likely weeks or longer. While it may seem like these miners are creating their own little community underground, kind of like a fallout shelter, an entirely new city is popping up on the surface of this mine, consisting of concerned citizens, volunteers, and most importantly, family members of those stuck in the mine. After days being stuck in this mine, the miners are unsure if anybody is ever going to come save them, until a noise is heard, a faint drilling noise from above, and they realize that help is on the way, and that somebody is drilling into the mountain. The team drilling above correctly assume that the surviving miners are going to be residing in the refuge, and it's for that reason that they aim a drill from the surface directly to the refuge, and a new challenge appears, accurately setting up the drill to ensure that it reaches the refuge, because even being a percentage of a percent off on the surface, by the time they reach the depth of the refuge could be multiple feet off, meaning that they need to completely reset and re-drill once again. To ensure that this rescue mission goes as smoothly as possible, the Chilean government not only acquires the support of other larger mine rescue teams, but also contacts NASA for consultation to ensure that they are taking the best possible course of action. While a team of experts is ensuring that the drill is put in the perfect position, another group of rescuers try accessing the ventilation shafts once again to ensure that they are completely impossible to save the miners. And unfortunately, it's confirmed. And not only did they confirm that the ventilation shafts are useless, they also confirmed that the diorite rock is still moving. Meaning that not only was there a large cavern that the diorite rock fell from, creating a ton of unstable ground in the cavity that it left, but it also means that this large rock that is now blocking the path is also still unstable and moving, while only slightly. Unfortunately, the drilling isn't going much better. And at this point, the drill has bent and broken multiple times, and the rescue holes that they've started have been abandoned twice. And due to the discovery of the diorite rock moving, the primary entrance of the cave has been closed and sealed forever. Now meaning that the only way of saving these miners is by successfully digging a 2,000-foot hole that spans from the surface perfectly into the refuge without collapsing. At this point in the story, we are 14 days into these 33 men being trapped underground, and we are still only just getting started. The head of this rescue mission made an executive decision. They are not going to drill faster, but they're going to drill slower. They begin re-drilling, but turn the drill to half speed to ensure that the drill does not malfunction or break course, as accuracy in this situation is paramount. It's already been proven that trying to rush this drilling would only take longer due to all the possible and likely failures. And it's at this point when things get crazy. 17 days since the collapse, the slow drilling procedure has been semi-successful, and while the drill breaks through into something, they don't know what they had broken through to. And as they remove the drill to insert a camera to inspect where the drill ended up, they noticed that the drill had something attached to it. There was a note attached to it. A note from the miners below. They had contacted them, and to those above, this was the first confirmation that there was any living miners stuck in this cave. The letter described exactly where the drill had broken through in the mine, and also was a personal letter to members of the family from the miners, as they were still completely unsure if their fate was sealed or not. The last thing written on the note is the most important of all. It is a simple confirmation that all 33 miners are alive and well. And this brings the morale of all rescuers to an all-time high. But the job is still not over yet. Like, just think about it. Imagine 17 days ago, over 2 weeks ago, you are told that your family is dead in a mine and that your father, brother, uncle, cousin was in a gold mine that collapsed and that they are dead. And if the collapse didn't kill them, then being underground for 17 days definitely did. But then all of a sudden getting confirmation that not only your loved one, but everybody's loved one is alive in this mine. That has got to be the most intense roller coaster of emotions. Now that they have a hole that goes directly to the refuge, they drill 2 more. One for supplies and one that is intended to be used for rescue. The miners underground now have communication to the surface through a phone that was dropped down one of the supply holes. They have food, medicine, and water provided to them through one of these holes. And while things look amazing, they are still trapped underground. From day 17 till day 65, drilling continues to make a large enough hole to take people out of the refuge, and development continues on a pod that will be sent down this hole and retrieve these people. Essentially an elevator-like tube that can take one person at a time in and out of the cave. And on day 65, both of these new tools are put into place. There is a hole that is wide enough to take people in and out of the refuge, and an experimental device created by the Chilean Navy with support from NASA is ready to be tested. It's a metal tube that can be dropped and retrieved out of the cave, and it's now officially going to begin its first test run. A rescuer bravely enters this pod and descends down into the mine. Unsure if this pod will even make it down to the bottom of the mine safely, or even if it does make it safely, if it's able to go back up. However, a rescuer is required to descend with the pod to give proper instructions on how to safely use it and to give some support to those who have been underground at this point for 65 days. The first miner, who is already pre-selected by the group, enters the pod and makes his 15-minute journey up through the pod, and without a hitch, makes it to the surface successfully and safely. The first of these 33 miners to see the surface for over 2 months. Throughout the night, all 33 of these men were taken to the surface safely, where thousands of people stood by for the rescue and millions of people were watching worldwide on TV as this rescue was broadcasted globally. All of these men were deemed in good physical condition, and they were all instructed to wear sunglasses because they had been in essentially darkness for 2 months, and the sunlight could be harsh on their eyes. All of the men visited the hospital to ensure their vitals, and only 2 of them weren't instantly released. The 2 that weren't instantly released required either dental or some psychological help, both of which had those addressed successfully as well. This entire rescue mission was insane, and the fact that these men were able to survive for so long proves their mental and physical resilience. And I could not imagine the feeling of finally reaching the surface after over 2 months underground to see so many people screaming and cheering and celebrating the success of your rescue. This entire rescue mission cost over $20 million, with the majority of that money coming from private donations. The story, once again, is such a heartwarming example of communities and people coming together to save those in need. And I really wanted to highlight that element specifically in this video, because a lot of videos on these topics don't do that. They focus on the negative, which I get. And I guess if you want your little bit of negativity, here's something that'll piss you off. Investigations that took place after the rescuers were saved determined that there was no criminal charges responsible to the mining company for this collapse that happened, even though it was known for its unsafe conditions. And while that's an entirely different story for a different video, it's something to ponder on. Many of these men were giving donations and gifts from wealthy people who sympathized with their situation, but these gifts did not allow them to retire, and these men had to make a living, most of them returning to mining, believe it or not. And I knew I had to add it on this list of crazy and insane rescue missions. How the most notorious serial killers were caught. The year is 1888, and you are located in Whitechapel, England, one of the roughest areas in London's East End. You, like most of the people in your life and in Whitechapel, don't live a life of luxury at all. You struggle to make ends meet, and tonight don't even have the 2 pence to pay for a place to sleep. You used to have a more or less picturesque life until your husband died, and since being on your own, like many women at the time, you resorted to selling your body. Whitechapel wasn't a booming metropolitan area, but it did contain over 62 brothels and over 1,200 prostitutes at the time. So to you, it was a better option than starving. With nowhere else to go, you spent the last few hours at the pub you frequented, and as the pub began to close, the bartender sensed that you weren't able to pay your bill. Unfortunately, they told you tonight it was on the house, as they knew you had fallen onto some tough times. You stumble out of this bar, beyond drunk, into the dark labyrinth that is the Whitechapel streets, and you begin to take the long and ominous walk home. At this time, it had to be at least 2 or 3 in the morning. The street was so dimly lit and the fog was so thick, you could barely see a person standing a few feet in front of you. Luckily, the labyrinth of small roads was something you were more than familiar with and could do with your eyes closed. And while there was nobody on this street beside yourself, you do notice a figure in the distance, something that you knew wasn't typically there. It wasn't a lamppost, and it wasn't an animal. As you get closer, you realize that it's a man in a dark trench coat and tall hat. As your drunken thoughts begin to process what you're looking at, you realize that this man was your golden ticket. You had just possibly found a place to stay tonight and even a way to make a few dollars. And as you approach this man, you try to put yourself together and approach him confidently. You walk right up to him and tell him that if he's looking for a good time, you can both go back to his place, and before you could even finish your offer, you slowly notice this man developing an unnatural smirk. And before you're even fully able to process this unnerving smile, you notice something. The reflection of what streetlight was available twinkled off of an object that this man just pulled out of his pocket, although it wasn't a pocket watch or change. This man had just pulled out a 7-inch knife. You instantly realize you need to run away as soon as possible, but your alcohol-induced delayed reaction time prevented you from taking any action, and the only thing you could do was let out a gasp before this man raises the knife and cuts your existence short. Only a few hours later, together at the very crack of dawn. A man is slowly venturing down a cobblestone road when he sees something on the sidewalk. He notices a woman on the sidewalk. Although this wasn't the typical Whitechapel homeless person. This was a woman face down, surrounded by blood. This man instantly gets out of his buggy, flips this woman over, only to realize that this woman was not only injured, but brutally murdered. Her neck was stabbed multiple times, and her torso was not only stabbed, but mutilated, with her intestines almost spilling out of her torso. This grim and disgusting discovery was one of the many victims of Jack the Ripper, and the start of a hunt for truth that would last over 137 years. There's no doubt that Jack the Ripper is one of the most notorious, if not the most notorious serial killer of all time. And of course, we're going to discuss exactly how he was caught. But before we discuss how he was caught, it's important to understand exactly how he wasn't caught so long ago. Obviously, technology wasn't nearly advanced as it was now, but that doesn't mean that crimes weren't solved. And in the case of Jack the Ripper, there was plenty of situations where Jack was very close to being caught and truthfully should have been caught. But we'll get to that. One of the biggest factors that consistently contributed to Jack the Ripper being able to go on for so long without being identified was the location of where he lived. As I mentioned earlier, Whitechapel was a rough area. And although it was tight and crowded, people weren't necessarily paying attention to others as they had enough to focus on. And weird things going on weren't so weird there. People shouting in the streets, people sleeping in the streets, people fighting, people with blood on their clothes, all weren't necessarily uncommon in a place where people were struggling to survive, dealing with disease, violence, and crime, and truthfully just trying to make it to their next meal, let alone their own next day. This gave Jack a lot of leeway to commit some truly horrendous crimes as long as he wasn't directly in anybody's eyesight. Another major contributing factor to the reason why he wasn't caught at the time is because he was only active for a few years. Obviously, being an active serial killer for any period of time is unacceptable. However, if you've seen any of our videos on serial killers, you would know that some killers are active for decades. At the time, it wasn't known how long Jack the Ripper was active, as his identity was unknown. Although, with the information that we have now, we can pinpoint exactly when he stopped killing and why he did too. But before we discuss that, let's first discuss how Jack the Ripper even earned a name as a serial killer. This brings us back to our initial story. A woman being found dead in the Whitechapel streets wasn't common, but wasn't unheard of. But what was unheard of was the sheer level of mutilation that occurred on her body. If this happened only once, there would be no Jack the Ripper. But the volume and consistency of these attacks in such a short amount of time were what fueled the media to create a monster, and one of the first ever famous serial killers. In 1888 alone, there is 5 confirmed killings associated with Jack the Ripper. These 5 victims are known as the canonical 5. And the reason these 5 victims are confirmed to be victims of Jack the Ripper are because they all exhibit trademarks of Jack's method of murder. All of these 5 women were either underprivileged, vulnerable, or had recently fallen onto hard times. And most notably, all of these victims had been murdered and brutally mutilated in such a specific manner. But it wasn't mutilation alone that created Jack the Ripper's signature murder. It was how precise and consistent these mutilations were. Coroners and doctors who inspected these victims once they were found would all remark that whoever had done this must have been experienced with a knife in some way, whether they were a doctor or a butcher or a shoemaker. And during the time that these murders were being investigated in the late 1800s, people in those exact professions, among others, were questioned, as whoever was wielding this knife and mutilating these women was no amateur. And that is beyond unsettling. As these murders were first being discovered, people believed that there was multiple murderers on the loose, as people were being killed more than ever, and these murders were happening so close to each other. And for 2 of the canonical 5 victims of Jack the Ripper, they were even murdered in the same night, 45 minutes apart from each other. And for that fact, it's reasonable to assume that it might have been multiple people. However, like I mentioned, the sheer consistency of these mutilations made it hard to believe there was more than one person. And with every murder, the newspaper was feeding more and more into the story that a monster was on the loose. Obviously, the newspapers covered these strange murders to keep locals up to date on what was happening, although some speculate that the newspaper was pushing the story for ulterior motives as well. The name Jack the Ripper didn't come from the police or from the public. It was a name that was referenced in a letter that was sent to the media from somebody claiming to be the murderer. That letter, known as the Dear Boss letter, at that time and until today was considered to be a hoax. However, Jack the Ripper must have gotten word about this hoax and decided to confirm things once and for all. As shortly after the Dear Boss letter was submitted to the media, another letter was submitted to the media, known as the From Hell letter. However, this letter was more convincing, as it wasn't just a written statement from somebody claiming that they were the murderer. It was a letter that stated that it was from the murderer and proved it by including half of a kidney in the letter. This half kidney was from one of the victims of Jack the Ripper. And it was at that point when the newspaper and the general public knew that they had one deranged individual on their hands. And it was also that letter that launched Jack the Ripper from local terror to nationwide and later global infamy. Up until last year, that's basically where the story would have ended. Jack the Ripper was never caught, his identity was never known, and he was somebody that truly terrorized not only his city, but the world. That was until recently. In 2007, a self-proclaimed Jack the Ripper expert named Russell Edwards bought a shawl. But it wasn't any shawl. He wasn't upgrading his wardrobe. He bought a shawl that was believed to have been owned by one of the victims of Jack the Ripper. And not only that, but the shawl was also present at a murder scene and was likely to have DNA on it. And it was this purchase that led to one of the biggest cold cases being solved in almost 150 years. Edwards gave this shawl that he had purchased to a biochemist and tasked him with finding any DNA possible. And that's exactly what he did. And only a few years later, a peer-reviewed article on the DNA analysis that the biochemist was able to find was published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 2019. The article that this biochemist published claimed exactly what Russell Edwards had written about all the way back in 2014, that Jack the Ripper was a man named Aaron Kosminski. And while this article has been criticized by scientists for making misassumptions, it does make a pretty compelling case, and at the very least, provides a bit more context to the entire Jack the Ripper situation. Aaron Kosminski was born on September 11th, 1865, in Poland, but emigrated to England in the 1880s. He lived in Whitechapel, in the East End of London, and his occupation was a barber, or hairdresser. That alone is interesting because that confirms that Aaron Kosminski was in the area of the Jack the Ripper killings when they happened, and he also was in a profession that wasn't a stranger to sharp objects. But the information gets deeper. In 1891, Kosminski was institutionalized after he threatened his own sister with a knife. Coincidentally, 1891 was the same year that the suspected Jack the Ripper killings stopped happening. Aaron Kosminski spent the rest of his life institutionalized. And while information about his time in these sanitariums is relatively undocumented, or at least deeply archived, it is documented that he did suffer with severe schizophrenia, leaving him very troubled. Which is also interesting because the things that Jack the Ripper did would, in my opinion, only be the result of somebody who was truly disturbed. But on top of all of these similarities and coincidences, the biggest claim of the article submitted by the biochemist that Russell Edwards had commissioned was that they claimed to have a DNA link between Aaron Kosminski and DNA found on the shawl of the Jack the Ripper victim. It was actually a 100% DNA match. And that piece of evidence alone was the nail in the coffin, and what sparked a lot of the news you likely saw this year of Jack the Ripper's identity finally being revealed. Over the years, there's been a handful of interesting theories about who Jack the Ripper truly was, but I think the argument that it was Aaron Kosminski is definitely the most compelling. But with that being said, was Jack the Ripper ever truly caught? Well, if Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper, then his identity was revealed, which means something. But also, if it was Aaron Kosminski, that does mean that he was institutionalized in 1891 for the rest of his life, meaning that he was imprisoned not for his crimes, but for his illness. His illness that likely sparked these crimes. So although you could argue Jack the Ripper was still not 1000% confirmed, I do think that there is a strong argument that Aaron Kosminski is Jack the Ripper. And for that reason, I do believe he was caught. But even if you don't agree, I think this story is extremely interesting. It adds, if nothing else, new layers to one of the coldest cases in serial killer history. But this is only the first case of 3 that we're covering in this video, so let me summarize. How exactly did Jack the Ripper get caught? According to the evidence we have, he got caught because he was consistently killing. He killed in a very methodical way. He confirmed he was a man acting alone in a letter he wrote to the media. And that letter not only confirmed that he was one person, but also gave the media ammo to create this spectacle that was Jack the Ripper. And it was this spectacle that got him caught. Because if the media didn't make Jack the Ripper the big boogeyman that he was, there would not be Jack the Ripper historians in the modern day. And if there was no Jack the Ripper in the modern day, there would be no collector buying this old shawl that was at the scene of the crime. And there would be nobody to give it to a biochemist to check it for DNA. And it's interesting to think, if Jack the Ripper never had written that letter, would we be talking about him today? And would he have ever been caught? I guess we'll never know. But let's move on. Saturday, August 24th, 1985. You are a 13-year-old boy. and you had just returned home to Southern California from a road trip with your family. The road trip was fun, but the entire time there was an eerie undertone, as your parents and the family you had been visiting out of town were all focused on one subject: the serial killer that had been on the loose in Southern California. You didn't know much of the situation, and truthfully, you weren't too interested, but you overheard your parents talking about some sort of night stalker. And between overhearing your parents and news coverage, it was hard not to have some sort of context about what was going on. And from what you understood, there was this crazy man on the loose who at this point had killed 13 innocent people, and was still not only not caught, but not even identified. This to you was scary, but what was about to happen on this fateful night was going to be a lot scarier. You return home from your family vacation later in the night, and you spent the evening unpacking, something that you delayed doing because you were watching your favorite VHS. It was a movie known as Back to the Future, and it only came out a month prior, and watching this movie kept you up later than usual, and this movie left you excited and unable to sleep, which is why you were up at midnight, which for you was later than usual. The rest of your family was sleeping, so you made sure to be quiet and keep to yourself. It was until you realized that you left your favorite pillow in the family RV, and you weren't going to bed without it, so you had to quietly sneak out to it to get it, obviously without waking your parents. You tiptoe outside, and once you make it into the yard, you hear something that sounds like footsteps, but you're not alarmed. You have a large backyard that's unfenced that backs onto a hill, and seeing possums, raccoons, and even deer weren't necessarily uncommon, and you were curious to see what was making all of this noise. You don't see any animal or anything at all, and figure whatever little critter it was must have scurried away. And since you're outside, you figured, why not go to the garage and work on your bike a little bit? Back to the Future got you inspired to tinker around, and maybe you were about to build the first time-traveling bike. And it was shortly into this tinkering session that you once again heard footsteps, but this time it was different. There was no suspicion of this being an animal. You were certain that you were hearing a person walking around the property. Your biggest fear was that your dad was coming out to see what you were up to, but what was actually outside was much more terrifying. It only took a few moments for you to realize that whoever was outside wasn't your dad, because they didn't enter the garage and they didn't say anything. You had an odd feeling and decided to hide behind the car and realized that you couldn't be here. You bolted out of the garage directly into the house, and as soon as you got into the house, you looked out the window to see exactly what was outside. And that's when you see a man walking around your home. You see this man start to walk away, and before he fully leaves your property, you want to get one last look to see if you know who this man could be and what he was doing there. And as you run from your bedroom out through the kitchen to the garage, your dad stops you in the kitchen and asks you, "What are you doing? Why are you up at this hour?" Hastily, you tell your dad that there's a man in the yard and you need to see who he is and what he's doing now. And after explaining this entire situation in only a matter of seconds, you shove your dad out of the way and run into the yard, when you catch a glimpse of a figure wearing a baseball cap, a jacket, and blue jeans. And although you can't identify this figure, you see them get into an orange Toyota hatchback with a chrome roof rack. As this man got into his car, you run into the road to follow him. And although his car is facing the opposite direction to you, he doesn't just drive off. He does a U-turn in the middle of the road to go the opposite direction. And this gives you the opportunity to see this man's face. The man drove off, and you, confused, go back inside and explain everything to your dad. Concerned, your dad already had the police called, and rather swiftly, the police were at the door taking a written statement. But it was only an hour later when the police called back to get even more information. And then a few hours later, at 6 in the morning, the police once again returned for more information. And the reason why the police returned at 6 in the morning was because only a mile and a half away from your home, there was another mysterious murder. And it happened only shortly after your initial report was made. And it was at that point when everything had clicked. Initially, you and your parents assumed that there must have been some sort of potential burglar lurking in the yard that was scared away when he saw that people were up. But once the police had confirmed that there was a murder only a mile from your home, they suspected that you didn't find a burglar, but that you likely came face to face with Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. 2 days later, on August 27th, 1985, the police identified a vehicle that matched the description that you had given them. It was an orange Toyota hatchback with a chrome roof rack parked on the side of the road. The police had this car towed and impounded, likely to provoke the owner to show up to reclaim it and then to be investigated. When the police towed this car, they asked you, "Is this the car that you saw that night?" and you confirmed it. And the reason why they towed this car initially is because on the night when they took their official statement, you told them that you saw this exact car. And you even remembered the first few digits of the license plate. This alone was a huge breakthrough in the case, and was one of the major turning points that got Richard Ramirez caught. Once the vehicle was confirmed to be the one that they saw that night, police investigated the entire vehicle, finding very little evidence. That was until they found a single fingerprint on the driver's side mirror, a fingerprint that linked the driver of the vehicle to Richard Ramirez. And at that point, a photo and name was submitted to the public as a person of interest. And it was at that point when the floodgates on this case burst open. One day after the name and photo were submitted to the public, on August 31st, 1985, Richard Ramirez was trying to steal a vehicle. And while attempting to steal this vehicle, an altercation broke out. And this altercation got the attention of neighbors. And although Ramirez was able to get car keys from a woman that he had just assaulted, before he could drive away with this vehicle he had attempted to steal, a neighbor had pulled Ramirez out of the vehicle, and other neighbors at this point had also approached the vehicle and began to beat and restrain Ramirez. The police were called, showed up, and arrested the man. And 1 week later, the police called you one final time to identify the person you saw that night in a lineup. You looked at 5 criminals standing beside each other, and you instantly recognized the man who you saw in your backyard. You tell the police that that was the man you saw that night, and it was your testimony that led to the Night Stalker being caught once and for all. The boy in the story that identified Ramirez is known as James Ramiro, and he is truly one brave young man. Not even a young man, he's like 13, he's literally a boy, like a child. And perhaps him being so naive allowed him to have the confidence and the blissful ignorance to follow a mysterious man into your backyard in the middle of the night. As a grown man, I wouldn't do that alone, even if I was armed. Regardless, James being up late that night and deciding to follow this man to the yard ultimately led to the downfall of one of the most notorious serial killers in American history, and undoubtedly saved the lives of innocent people that Richard Ramirez would have victimized next. On September 20th, 1989, Richard Ramirez was convicted of all charges and was sentenced to death. His convictions specifically were 12 counts of first-degree murder, 11 counts of second-degree murder, and 14 counts of first-degree burglary. And although he was on death row, he died on June 7th, 2013 at the age of 53 of lymphoma. I think the story kind of tells itself here. James was an absolute legend of a boy, and Ramirez was a troubled excuse for a man. And although Ramirez was unfortunately able to victimize so many innocent people, justice was at least eventually served, largely in part to James. So exactly how did the Night Stalker get caught? Well, he messed with the wrong boy staying up past his bedtime. The year is 1998. You live in a small town in England known as Hyde, and you have recently been going through some distressing times with your family. Your father-in-law has been experiencing very odd medical symptoms, and it's believed that he may have cancer. Obviously, wanting the best, you and your family decide to go to one of the most respected and well-known doctors in the entire city of Hyde, a man named Harold Shipman. Your father-in-law gets an examination, and a few days later, you call him to follow up on the prognosis. The doctor on the phone rather firmly responds, "I wouldn't buy him any Easter eggs," which was a harsh way of delivering news that someone was going to die soon. Almost eerie, as Easter was only 2 weeks away. Due to the shock of the news you've just received, you appreciate him telling you the truth, and you hang up the phone and begin talking to your family. Your family took this news a little bit softer, as they believed that he was being metaphorical and almost joking, saying that the end was soon, but there was no way that it could have been this soon, right? Regardless, your family started to make the appropriate plans. And almost on cue, only 4 days later after that phone call, even earlier than the doctor had claimed, your father-in-law had passed away. The truth behind his death was a lot more disturbing than simply him succumbing to the disease he had. You meet with the doctor after your father-in-law's passing to discuss if anything could have been done and what really happened and why this was so sudden. And the doctor, rather sternly yet calmly and somewhat compassionately, described to you that sometimes things happen so fast, and realistically in situations with terminal illness, there's not much you can do. This doctor tells you that an autopsy isn't required and that you should plan the funeral as soon as possible to begin the grieving process. And like many others before you, you take his advice and opt to not have an autopsy. This practice was common for Harold Shipman, as he not only advocated for all of his patients who had family members who passed away to not only not get an autopsy, but also to get a cremation as fast as possible. But as you likely already know, these recommendations weren't coming from a place of compassion, but instead out of a place of self-preservation. And the reason why I say this is because Harold Shipman was actively killing his patients. He targeted typically elderly women and sometimes elderly men too, and for the most part victimized people who were already terminally ill and unlikely to be suspected of accidental or intentional death. Harold was a troubled individual, there was no doubt about it. His mother passed away at a young age, and he struggled with drug abuse in his early career as a doctor and was even admitted to a facility. However, it wasn't put on his record and he was only given a warning. This allowed him to continue practicing and even to get his own private practice, which may sound like a fortunate second chance, although that optimism slips away when you realize what happened within his private practice. Harold was no longer addicted to heroin, but he was seemingly addicted to giving his target patients a lethal dose of diamorphine, the same drug that was given to his mother when she was dying. Harold Shipman was suspected of killing his victims as early as 1975, and it wasn't until 1998 when suspicions of foul play began to become overwhelming. As in small communities, word spreads quickly, and it was at that point when Harold Shipman was investigated. Upon investigation, it was confirmed that Harold Shipman's mortality rate as a doctor was 10 times above the average. Yet, when the health authority investigated all of the paperwork associated with these patients and their deaths, they found no irregularities, which at the time lowered suspicion. But as we know now, these papers were actually forged to fit the stories that he was spinning. And while the health authority was investigating the patients, the Greater Manchester Police were investigating Shipman, and unfortunately also failed, as they weren't even able to find his criminal history or the time he spent in an institution for his drug abuse. What this essentially means is that this first investigation into Harold Shipman almost cleared his name. It didn't clear suspicions, but legally speaking, Harold was doing nothing wrong. He was a standard doctor who unfortunately had some unlucky clients. But this story didn't last for long. Only a few months later, on June 24th, 1998, Harold made a very distinct choice that led directly to him being caught. Harold Shipman was at the home of one of his patients, a woman named Kathleen Grundy. This woman was 81 years old and described as being in great health. She had an appointment with Shipman at her home to have a routine blood test, although what she got instead was a lethal dose of diamorphine. As per his standard practice, he quickly wrote her death certificate and stated her cause of death as old age and suggested she be cremated immediately. But that wasn't the only document he forged. Somewhat unusually, he also forged a will, and it was Kathleen's will, giving all of her worldly possessions to her doctor, Harold Shipman. And it was this move specifically that raised more than a few red flags. Kathleen was a former mayor of Hyde, and for that reason was a notable person in the community, and her death was very upsetting to many, particularly her family, who were shocked not only that their healthy mother and grandmother passed away, but also that she'd left all of her money to her doctor. And with that, they began investigating Harold themselves, when they quickly realized that he was behind not only the forgery, but also the death. The family was able to confirm that Harold's fingerprints were on the will that he forged, and that the will was even typed on his typewriter that was missing a key, which undoubtedly confirmed that he was the one who wrote it. And this family somehow was able to find out about Harold's past when the police weren't able to, which at the very least is odd and borderline negligent by the police. Kathleen's family demanded that her body be autopsied, and it was during that autopsy when it was found that she had a lethal dose of diamorphine in her muscle tissue, and Harold Shipman was arrested for the murder of Kathleen Grundy. Once he was arrested, the family of 11 other victims who had their family member buried and not cremated opted to have their family members' bodies examined by the police. And these examinations also showed that these 11 other patients of Harold Shipman were also victims of his. And it was at this time that Harold Shipman was convicted of 15 murders from 1995 to 1998. Although in the investigations that followed his initial conviction, there was over 284 confirmed killings by Harold Shipman. And there are even more that are unconfirmed but likely possible. Just let that sink in. He was only convicted of 15 murders, but he was confirmed to have killed at least 284 of his patients, likely from the years of 1975 to 1998. Harold received life in prison, although only a few years into his sentence, he ended his own life on January 13th, 2004 at the age of 57. Shipman never gave any motive for his murders and never admitted to any of it. These are just 3 cases of how some of the most infamous serial killers were caught. And if you are interested in hearing more, unfortunately, there is more stories to tell. Unfortunate because these stories involve real victims, and I try to be as respectful as possible of that fact. The craziest execution methods from around the world. When you talk about executions, everybody seems to talk about what their last meal would be, but nobody seems to talk about what their execution method would be. And in this video, I'm going to show you some truly obscure and brutal execution methods from around the world that you would never want to experience. And as always, this video only gets more brutal as the list goes on. Italy. Falling. Italy has a long and rich history, and for that reason, I'm going to give a few examples of how they used this one torture method throughout different parts of its history in different ways. Let's start in pre-Roman Sardinia. Imagine you're just an old person living in your little hut, maybe on the coast of the island that you reside on. You realize that you're getting up there in age and realize that soon the ritual was going to happen. One day, a group of young men come into your house and tell you it's ritual time, and you prepare for what's about to happen, as you've seen it happen to other men your age. You're first given a mysterious neurotoxic drink. You are then carried to a nearby cliff by these young men. But these young men aren't just on this cliffside to watch the sunset with you. They are raising you above their head Lion King style and throwing you off a cliff. That's right. The first execution method we're talking about is falling. Definitely one of the most simple entries on this list, but trust me, the implications are pretty wild. In this first example I gave in pre-Roman Sardinia, people were literally just executing the elderly. Like, this was a common ritual. During this time, if you were an elderly person who was unable to support themselves, you were ritually killed. And this was just an accepted practice in pre-Roman Sardinia. And as I described, how this would typically go is they would get the old person intoxicated through a neurotoxic plant that was known as the sardonic herb. Regardless, once they get their elderly victim nice and high, they will take them somewhere nice and high. And at that point, they have one of two options. They are either dropped from a high height or beaten to death and then dropped from a high height. And that's just the Sardinian version of an old folks home. There's really not too much more to say about literally falling off a cliff, but it is an interesting execution method, and I wanted to add it specifically for this reason because in Italy, they were just doing it differently. This wasn't the only time that falling was used as an execution method in modern day Italy. For example, during the Roman Empire, an emperor by the name of Tiberius was known to also use this method, also for an interesting reason. Emperors would execute people for a plethora of reasons, but Tiberius would specifically execute boys that he was no longer enjoying physically, if you get my drift. Once Tiberius felt that he had his fun with these boys, he would have them thrown off a cliff while he watched. But he was compassionate because he didn't have these boys thrown onto rock, he had these boys thrown into water. Obviously, being thrown into water could still lead to instant death or death by drowning, but there is a chance that these boys could survive. But don't worry, Tiberius definitely thought of this. So when he had these boys thrown off a cliff into the water, he had men in boats below waiting for these boys to land in the water where they could then break their bones with the oars if needed. So yeah, falling is definitely one of the most prehistoric and simple methods of execution. But in Italy, back in the day, they were using it for some very strange reasons. But let's move on. The United States. The upright jerker. I realize this execution method sounds like your nighttime routine, but trust me, it's not nearly as fun. You see, in the 19th and early 20th century, the United States was doing a lot of hangings. And as society began to get more civilized, they thought, maybe these public hangings everybody loves is a bit barbaric. We should definitely keep executing people in public, but let's do it differently. And the product of that thought was the upright jerker, which kind of sounds like a nickname you would give someone who sleepwalks and sleepwanks at the same time. Seriously though, where the upright jerker differed from the traditional hanging was as follows. Traditional hanging would take place on a gallows, typically high up with a trapdoor below the condemned person's feet. The executioner would open the trapdoor and the person would fall and the rope would snap their neck or quickly strangle them, with the weight of their body compressing their neck in the noose. During this time, there was a lot of high-profile botched hangings, which is why they decided to try something new, something that they thought would be more effective. The upright jerker differed from traditional hangings because instead of being dropped from a height onto your neck, you would start on the ground and actually be lifted up by your neck. This would happen with the same style of noose being connected to the victim's neck, although the rope would be connected to a series of pulleys that would be connected to weights. So when the executioner was ready, he would activate the system and the condemned person would be hoisted up into the air, typically instantly breaking their neck, and if not, similar to hanging, would slowly be strangulated to death. The name upright jerker comes from the victim obviously being upright and being shot into the air, but jerker refers to how the body would typically move after they would be flung into the air, because the pulley system would typically bounce the body up and down, jerking them. Definitely morbid. And an interesting take on hanging I haven't heard of until now. Sri Lanka. Crushing by elephant. I mean, you probably already get the idea, but I'm gonna give a bit more context because, believe it or not, there is some nuance to this. Unlike the very first example I talked about, this method was used on criminals, so we're at least off to a better start. How this execution method would work is, after the justice system of the time would do its thing, and then the person was then sentenced to death, they would then have them ready for the elephant execution. How this would look is the condemned person would be put on a pedestal, typically a smooth stone surface, and then they would bring in the elephants. But here's the thing, the elephant could go one of many ways. Depending on how trained the elephant was, they would either walk the elephant back and forth over top of the person until the elephant accidentally stepped on the vitals of this person, or if the elephant was more trained, the elephant would deliberately step on the person's limbs, torso, and even head to quickly execute the individual. Pretty simple, but extremely brutal. But these weren't the only ways that they would use elephants to their advantage. In some cases, they wouldn't even have the elephant step on the person at all, at least not at first. They wouldn't start with the person laying down. They would allow the elephant to grab the person by their trunk and throw them around. And then, once they were thrown to the ground, the elephant would then, do its little moonwalk. This method was used not only in Sri Lanka, but also in India and other parts of Asia for quite a long time, and was even popular up into the late 19th century, although in modern times it's no longer used. However, the terrifying stories still remain. And if you plan on becoming a time-traveling criminal, I definitely wouldn't recommend doing anything in Sri Lanka during the 17th, 18th, or 19th century, unless you want to get up close and personal with Dumbo. China. Execution vans. Okay, so this is the first modern method on the list, and surprise, surprise, is one of the only modern methods, because a lot of the modern methods now are humane as they can be, and most places don't even do executions anymore. But leave it to China to give us an interesting entry for this list. And while most countries around the globe have been decreasing or even entirely eliminating the amount of executions they're doing every year, China is actually raising those numbers and has a plethora of laws that if you break, you can be executed, which is for that reason why they have the execution van, which is exactly what it sounds like. It is literally a van that is kitted out to kill criminals. From the outside, the van appears to be a 24-person bus, with its windows covered and with minimal police markings. But on the inside of this bus, it almost resembles a hospital room, although nobody in this van is going to be healed. Typically, how it would work is once you end up on a Chinese death row, instead of going to a part of the prison where you'd be executed, you would be picked up by the van. And once in the van, you'd be strapped down to an operating style table and then injected with a lethal injection. And at that point, driven likely to the morgue. Truthfully, finding publicly available information on China's mobile execution chambers is a bit tough, although it's definitely not a secret. These execution vans have been in use since 2003 and are still in use to this day. Although technically this method is only lethal injection, I think the fact that China has systematized it to a point where they've made it a literal mobile execution chamber for maximum efficiency definitely earns it a spot on this list. Just imagine living in China and seeing this thing though. Like in your everyday life, when you see a hearse go by, you get kind of a feeling or a thought. But if you see an execution van go by, I can't imagine the literal aura of that thing. Can't be good. Spain, the garrote. Alright, buckle up, things are really taking a dark turn now. The garrote was used in the 1800s and the 1900s and was used not only in Spain but also in Spanish colonies, like the Philippines. And interestingly, the garrote was seen as a more merciful form of execution compared to the going technique of death by burning, which I'll let you make your own opinion on once I explain the garrote. The garrote consists of a small seat for you to sit on and a wooden plank going up your spine. Once in the seat, you would have a metal loop wrapped around your neck. And directly behind your head on the wooden post that your spine is aligned with would be essentially a big screw. And what this screw would do was actually twofold. Because as the executioner would turn the screw from behind your neck, a sharp piece of metal would slowly be pressing against the back of your neck. And with every turn, your neck would become crushed by the piece of metal literally securing your head to this post. And how this victim would die would vary. But the two most common methods were either one, having the person's brainstem literally explode due to the pressure from the spike going through the back of the neck, or if you were lucky, before you even got to that point, you were asphyxiated to death by the pressure on your neck through the metal loop. Regardless, the garrote is absolutely brutal. Just for a quick pop quiz, when do you think they stopped using this brutal device? The use was officially and finally abolished in 1978. Only 47 years ago. Chances are if you're watching this video, either your parents or possibly even yourself were alive during the time that this device was still in use. Some history isn't as far back as you think. Let's keep moving. Uzbekistan. Boiling alive. I'm gonna preface this by saying that historically, boiling alive was used a lot in both England and China. But because we already talked about China and we're going to be speaking about England, I decided to pin this on Uzbekistan because they have the most recent recorded usage of this method. Now you might be asking yourself, what exactly is the method? And let me tell you. Death by boiling is when somebody boils not just water, but also animal fat, motor oil, cooking oil, or really any liquid of their choice, and then they would submerge their victim into this boiling liquid. And the result would be likely one of the most excruciating experiences humanly possible. And for that reason, it's on the list. Historically, Henry VIII made boiling the official execution method for anybody who committed murder via poisoning, as well as anybody who committed high treason. And during the 16th century in Japan, Japanese bandits were boiled alive as well. But in more modern times, specifically from 1991 all the way until 2016, Uzbekistan is alleged to have been boiling suspected terrorists on the regular. And this is kind of confirmed by a United States Department of State document from 2004, which confirmed that the Uzbekistan government had tortured 2 gang members, and their bodies were extensively bruised, burned, and reportedly submerged in boiling water as well, making that allegation a little bit more real. And since we're speaking about boiling people alive in the modern day, there's a documentary that came out in 2010 about sicarios, the Latin American gang. And during this documentary, during an interview with a sicario, the sicario claimed that the Mexican cartel would boil alive anybody found to be working for the police. And these people were boiled alive in oil until they were no longer alive. So even though in the modern day, no country has boiling alive on their menu of official execution methods, there are definitely places where it's still being done, which is a terrifying thought. Ancient Rome, penalty of the sack. Ancient Rome's got a lot of history, and interesting execution styles is part of that history. Now, truthfully, penalty of the sack kind of sounds like something you'd pay a dominatrix for. But in reality, it's just the translation of the original Latin word, which I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce because, well, you guys roast me. And similar to the very first execution method that we talked about, this method of execution was reserved only for a specific crime. That crime being parricide, or killing a member of your immediate family. So at least it wasn't used on, someone just who was old. It was at least used on a murderer, but still, the question remains, what is the punishment of the sack? Whose sack is being punished? How do they punish the sack? And don't worry, it's at least 100 times worse than any form of cock and ball torture you could imagine. Okay, jokes aside, penalty of the sack went as follows. Someone would kill their parents, they would get caught, they would get convicted, then they are awaiting execution. Execution day comes, and this is how it plays out. The criminal is first put into either a barrel or a large burlap sack. The person is then told to curl up into a ball, and the bag or barrel that they are in is then either filled with snakes, monkeys, dogs, or chickens. And at that point, the barrel or sack is sealed, and then you are thrown into the water. So not only are you panicking in this small confined space while you are slowly drowning, you're also in there with a wild animal. Which, first of all, what did the animal do? What did this chicken, snake, dog, what did they do? They didn't do anything. That's just friendly fire. Imagine just being a chicken and getting caught in the crossfire because this guy killed his parents. Regardless, in ancient Rome, drowning was simply not enough. That's wild. Medieval Europe, rat torture. This method was pretty widely spread across all of Europe during the medieval era, so I'm just doing the region, not even the country. They were all guilty. Rat torture is definitely one of the most famous and one of the most brutal methods of execution likely ever used. And for that reason, you may already be familiar with this method. So I'll keep it brief. This method was used on any range of criminals, and although the method was considered torture, it essentially had a 99.99% fatality rate. Here's how it would work. You would be walked into the execution chamber, the dungeon, the medieval places where people died, and you would be strapped down. Once strapped down, you would have a rat placed typically on your stomach. And on top of that rat, they would place a small cage firmly on top of your stomach, trapping the rat onto your body. And now you officially have a pet rat. But unfortunately, this isn't the end of the torture method, as once this cage was secured to your body, the executioner would begin to apply typically heat to the rat to make it uncomfortable and force it to try to find a way out of this cage. And of course, it can't get through the metal cage, however, it could possibly burrow down. And that's exactly what would happen. This rat would begin to burrow and eat and scratch and claw through the person's body, typically going directly into their intestines, causing an excruciating and brutal experience that would typically not instantly kill you, but cause a slow, excruciating, painful death in anywhere from a few hours to even a few days in some cases. This death was typically brought on by a loss of blood or disease. And it's really as simple as that. I can't think of many things more brutal than having rats forced to burrow through your body while you're still alive. And yet, there's still one final entry on this list. England, drawing and quartering. For the final entry on this list, I knew there was only one suitable entry, that being drawing and quartering. Primarily because it's not even a single execution method. It is a combination of 3 used sequentially. And they intentionally keep you alive during the initial, I guess not even executions, just torture methods until they ultimately kill you. Drawing and quartering was reserved specifically for traitors. And this method was supremely brutal because they wanted to set a very strong example that if you were a traitor, that the consequences were above all else. And interestingly, this method of execution was actually so brutal that they didn't even do it on women. They only did it on men. This rule was in place because, spoiler alert, the men would be naked during part of this execution, and they figured it would be too indecent to do that to women. So instead, women only got beheaded or burned at the stake, which, as brutal as those are, they seem like child's play compared to drawing and quartering. So let's say you commit treason in medieval England. What exactly happens? First, you are removed from your jail cell and dragged by horse from the prison to the gallows. At that point, you are put on the gallows and hung, but not fully. You are only hung until you are half dead. Once the executioner feels that you are sufficiently hung, you are cut down. Once you are cut down, you are literally disemboweled, with the executioner removing your organs out of your body. And then the executioner will set your organs on fire. At that point, you are then beheaded. And then once you are beheaded, all 4 of your limbs are attached to separate horses, and the horses pull your body apart. And that is the long and short of drawing and quartering. And there was kind of variations on how this kind of happened, but this was the head honcho of all of the techniques used. Initially, I actually planned on putting tearing apart by animals on the list because that alone is an extremely brutal method of execution. But once I learned about drawing and quartering, I realized that I had to save being torn apart by any animal for the method that included that, along with 3 other literal execution methods. It's probably one of the most brutal execution methods of all time, and was extremely popular during medieval times, and was only abolished in the 19th century, which isn't super recent, but not super long ago either. The craziest prison escapes of all time. The Alcatraz escape. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, better known as Alcatraz, is likely the most iconic prison in the entire world. Alcatraz sits on top of a small island in the San Francisco Bay and started its life in the 1850s as a military fort, and then was converted to a military prison in the 1910s. And in the 1930s, the United States Department of Justice bought the military prison and turned it into what we know it as today, a former maximum security federal prison. Alcatraz was notorious for a couple of reasons, both of those reasons being extremely tied together. For starters, it was notorious because it was literally seen as an escape-proof prison. And that was because it combined the highest level technology possible within the walls of this prison, and it also coupled that with timeless prehistoric technology outside of the prison walls. What I mean by that is the literal mile of rough, shark-infested water surrounding the prison, making it extremely unique and almost one of a kind. Because sure, being inside a maximum security prison with all of the bells and whistles is one thing, but having all of those in combination with being on a remote island surrounded by rough, shark-infested water is just a whole nother level. And that is partially what made Alcatraz so famous. But obviously, they don't build these prisons for great people. These federal maximum security prisons exist for a reason, which brings us to the second reason why this prison was so notorious. It was home to some of the most infamous criminals of its time. For example, Al Capone, George Machine Gun Kelly, Alvin Karpis, and a bunch of others. So yeah, it's safe to assume that Alcatraz was likely the one prison that nobody could escape from. And from 1933 until 1962, that was considered true. There was multiple escape attempts, but none that were considered successful. That was until June 11th of 1962, when 3 men would cause not only national headlines, but also an ongoing mystery that still puzzles the world to this very day. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers were lifelong criminals, and by the time they had ended up at Alcatraz, they were no strangers to escape attempts. Frank Morris started his criminal career at the age of 13 and lived a life of crime primarily consisting of drugs and robbery. And throughout his time being in and out of this system, he had escaped multiple times from multiple different correctional facilities. He was likely able to escape due to his extremely high intelligence, and is recorded to have an IQ of 133, which is in the top 2% of the general population. But unfortunately, he decided to use his powers for evil. On the other hand, the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, didn't start their criminal career much later. Clarence was caught breaking into a service station when he was only 14 years old, and the brothers began robbing banks together not long after. They too had multiple escape attempts and successful escapes on their record, which may not come as a surprise considering the context of this video. Now that we have all of the information, one question still remains. What happens when you mix an inescapable prison with criminals that cannot be contained? Well, the answer lies in the following story. A story that is shrouded in irony, because sure, why wouldn't you want to have all of the extremely dangerous bad guys in one place? Well, because then you have all of the bad guys in one place where they can work together. And that is exactly what happened. Frank Morris, John Anglin, Clarence Anglin, and Alan West actually knew each other from previous convictions in Florida and Georgia. I guess you really are the sum of the 5 people you hang out with. Regardless, with all of their histories of prison escapes, it didn't take long for them to begin plotting their escape from Alcatraz, the prison that you're supposedly not able to escape. And after coming together to join forces, they come up with a plan to escape. And this plan starts by chipping away at cement. Oh, and if you're curious why I didn't mention Alan West earlier, you'll see why later. Just trust me. Obviously, being in a maximum security prison leaves minimal opportunities for easy escapes. But these criminals identified the weakest point of their cell being not the door, but the vent that was hidden under everybody's sink. And for a 6-month period, all 4 of these men begin widening the ducts beneath their sinks using saw blades, metal spoons, electric drill bits, anything they could get their hands on that would chip away at the cement. Now this alone brings up 2 questions. How did they hide the hole, and how did they cover the sound of chipping away at cement? Well, 2 simple answers. In regards to how they would hide chipping away at the hole, first of all, these men would take turn being on guard, watching for the guards that would typically only do their hourly patrol, but sometimes would do spontaneous patrols as well, where they would need to obviously make sure that the guards did not see them digging these holes. And once their daily digging session was complete, how they concealed them from the guards throughout the rest of the day when they weren't digging them was actually quite clever. All of these men made papier-mâché replicas of the vent and surrounding wall area, painted in the same color as the wall, from paint that one of these men stole from their prison job. How they covered the noise of digging was because one of the men actually played the accordion, and during music hour was the perfect opportunity to quickly and loudly bang away at the cement. Now, after roughly 6 months of digging, all of these men had access to what was behind their wall. And obviously this hole just didn't go outside. It led to a gap between the walls, consisting primarily of pipes. This unguarded utility area between cells was the perfect place to assess the situation. And once these men had access to this corridor, they climbed the pipes and found the closest exit they could find, which happened to be a vacant top-level cell block where they set up a secret workshop. The men weren't going to be escaping at this point in time, but they were getting extremely close to their great escape. In this vacant cell block, the men identified their escape route, which was a ceiling vent that they would need to pry open, but for them, that was no big task. And they spent the next few months bringing supplies up to their secret workshop, specifically raincoats, glues, magazines, pieces of plywood, anything that would be helpful and useful for their escape. Over time, the men were beginning to stitch together raincoats to build a makeshift raft, and putting together pieces of plywood to make makeshift paddles, and also reading magazines about water safety and mechanics to help educate themselves on the best way to essentially act on the water and make something to potentially float across the water. It was really quite ingenious. And once they had their raft, paddle, and escape vent pried open, they were ready to make their escape. Around 10 p.m. on June 11th, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers got out of their bed, put replica papier-mâché heads into their bed to make it appear that they were still in bed, and met up together in their secret workshop, where they grabbed their raft, broke the ceiling vent, and began their escape. These men climbed out of the vent on the ceiling onto the roof of Alcatraz, and then descended 50 feet off of the prison roof onto the prison grounds, hauling all of their gear while sliding down a kitchen vent pipe. The men somehow avoided the sniper towers and outdoor guards and climbed the 12-foot barbed wire fences and planted their boat in water on the shore that was a blind spot to searchlights and gun towers. And at that point, they had inflated their raft with an accordion and set sail. And the 3 of these men were never seen again. Now you might be asking yourself, wait, the 3 of these men? What happened to the 4th man? Well, Alan West wasn't as lucky as the other criminals. And on the night of the escape, when West tried to remove the papier-mâché concrete concoction that was covering the hole in the wall, he couldn't. The concrete that he had used to temporarily hold the vent in place during the day had hardened. And by the time he finally got the vent off and was able to make it to the secret workshop, the rest of the men were gone. And West simply accepted his fate and went back to his cell where he went to bed. That story alone is insane, and it's still not over yet. The 3 men had essentially made the perfect escape, and nobody knew of their escape until the next morning, when guards were doing their rounds and noticed that these 3 men were not waking up. And when one of the guards tried to poke Frank Morris in the head with his club, Morris's head literally fell to the ground. And it was at that moment when the prison guards had discovered that they had 3 men on the loose. The following day, on June 12th, almost instantly, military and law enforcement agencies began investigations on the air, land, and sea surrounding the prison. And while some bits and pieces of items used by the escapees were found spread across the general area, there is no recorded evidence of what happened to the 3 men after they left the Alcatraz grounds. During the investigation that took place on the 12th, Alan West was caught with his papier-mâché replica head. And at this point, the guards knew what the head was going to be used for. And Alan was about to be in a lot of trouble. And because of that, Alan was willing to give up all of the information he had to ensure that he didn't get in too much trouble for having this papier-mâché head. And fortunately, he did, because Alan is the biggest reason why we have all of the information we have about this entire escape. Without Alan essentially ratting on his friends, a lot of this prison escape would have been left to speculation. Now, if you want to get into a bit of conspiracy, since their escape, there has been alleged sightings of these escaped men, some in the United States, some in Brazil, and a letter has even surfaced supposedly being written from one of these escapees to a loved one, claiming that all of the men made it out alive, although none of these were ever confirmed. And it's very likely that all of the men that escaped Alcatraz that day either died during their escape or are dead now due to natural causes, or simply due to the consequences of living a life of crime. So yeah, when you mix a prison that is impossible to escape with prisoners that are impossible to keep confined, you get an ongoing mystery that lasts over 60 years. But as crazy as this story may be, we still have 2 more to cover. The Catch Me If You Can escapes. When you were a kid on the playground playing tag with your friends, did you ever say, "Catch me if you can," while running away? Well, Frank Abagnale said "catch me if you can" every day to the FBI for years while on the run for stealing millions of dollars and breaking a laundry list of other laws. The story of Frank Abagnale literally inspired the movie Catch Me If You Can. And today, I'm gonna tell the real story of exactly how he escaped prison both times. I did give a bit of a teaser on why he was put in jail, but let me give a bit more context. Frank Abagnale started at an early age, similar to the first story, when he moved to New York at the age of 16 by himself. He quickly realized that as a child, you can't do much, so he decided to no longer be a child. He altered his driver's license to say 26, not 16. Not only does he need to be an adult, but he needs money, and living in New York is not cheap. So what's the natural next step? Get a job, right? Earn some money? Of course not. You start defrauding banks with fraudulent checks. And that's exactly where Frank Abagnale Jr. started his infamous streak of conning and crime. Frank wasn't your average run-of-the-mill fraudster, and he was rather clever and charming. And one of the biggest reasons why he was able to get away with his crimes for so long is because he was a serial imposter, specifically by impersonating professionals when cashing these checks so that there was less scrutiny and chance of being figured out. He faked being a pilot, a doctor, a lawyer, and other white-collar professions to ensure that he was not on anybody's radar. And obviously, it worked. After collecting millions of dollars from these fraudulent checks and living a luxurious lifestyle and traveling the world on money that wasn't his, Frank was ultimately caught. Frank was initially caught in France, where he spent time in both French prisons and Swedish prisons. And after serving time in both countries and being banned from Sweden, Frank was deported back to the United States of America. And when Frank's plane landed in New York City, while it was still on the tarmac, Frank was able to escape the plane through the kitchen galley. And not only did he escape the plane through the galley, but he also escaped from the airport on foot. Keep in mind, airports are pretty secure places. And I guess this was, a different time, if you know what I mean. But still, that's a pretty crazy feat. This is the tame prison escape of the 2, which is why I'm kind of covering it a bit quickly. Frank ended up being on the run for a few weeks until he was caught once again, this time at the Montreal airport. You'd think this guy would have learned his lesson around airports, but I guess not. It's also a bit ironic that he was caught in Quebec, a French-speaking Canadian province. Regardless, it's this second capture which sparks the crazy story of his second escape from prison. Frank was sent to a federal detention center in Atlanta, Georgia, where he was awaiting his trial. And it was at this detention center where he pulled off the most lucky and almost funny prison escapes. The US Marshal that brought Frank Abagnale into this detention center somehow managed to forget Abagnale's paperwork. And this gave Abagnale a lot of room to come up with convenient stories. And the story that he began to spin was that he was a prison inspector, a secret shopper of penitentiaries, if you will. And because of this, although he was incarcerated, he was given very special treatment, specifically by the guards. One of the most interesting perks that Frank got was he actually wasn't even in a prison jumpsuit. He was allowed to wear street clothes, which may seem simple, but is a huge privilege. So even though Frank is locked up, he's not necessarily in a bad situation. Guards are speculating that because there's no papers, he must be a prison inspector. Frank is definitely not gonna tell them that's not the case. He's being given special treatment in this jail, which is almost unheard of. And he then gets the idea that, maybe I can get out of this place. And that's exactly where his escape begins. After he decided that he was going to escape, he calls his girlfriend, as he knew that he would need somebody on the outside to help validate the story he was about to tell. When he called his girlfriend, he ensured that she had an FBI business card from an agent that previously visited her due to some other things that Frank was up to, and then he asked her to impersonate a magazine writer, which she did, and she used this fake writer persona to set up a meeting with the real police inspector, who she would also get the business card of, which was the entire point of the meeting. Once Frank's girlfriend had the FBI's card and the prison inspector's card, they were well on their way to breaking Frank out. She went to a local paper copy place and made 500 copies of the FBI agent's business card, but she changed the contact number on the business card to a payphone in a mall. During her next visit, she gave Frank both of these business cards, and with these business cards in hand, Frank was able to convince prison guards that he, in fact, was a prison inspector. Frank convinced one of these guards that he had an urgent meeting with the FBI and that he needed to be released immediately, and he even urged the guard to call the FBI agent's number on the business card that he had, which he did. And when this prison guard called the FBI agent, it was really Abigail who was waiting at the mall. And Abigail played that part perfectly, claiming that Frank had extremely sensitive information that he needed to give to her immediately, and that this information was too high level for this prison guard to be made aware of. And for that reason, the FBI agent was going to come pick up Frank at once because his prison inspection had come to a close. And later that day, prison guards walked Frank directly out of the prison, allowing him to walk directly into his girlfriend's car, and Frank drove off into the sunset once again as a free man. Although this perfect escape didn't have a perfect ending. At least, not in the way that he thought, because he was caught only a month later in New York. Frank was sentenced to 12 years in prison, where he actually ended up only serving 5, as he made a deal with the FBI that he would be released early if he would help the FBI on fraud cases and teach them all of the tricks that he used to commit all of the crimes that he did. A good deal both ways around. Now, the story actually ended up having a bit of a happy ending, because Frank really did turn his life around. He was able to be a very valuable asset to the FBI. He actually met his wife while doing FBI work and had 3 sons, and one of his sons is actually now an FBI agent. And while the escape story was utter insanity, one of the most interesting facts about this entire case is the fact that after all of the crimes were committed, all of the time on the run, and all of the jail time was served, Frank was only 26 years old, which means that everything I just described happened when he was 16 to 26. This man literally lived a lifetime's worth of life in a decade. And it's no wonder that he had such a successful book and eventual movie adaptation. There's obviously a lot more to Frank's life story, but that's beyond the scope of this video. And speaking on beyond the scope of this video, let me just say this. When doing research for this video, I found so many insane stories about people escaping prison in literally insane ways. And for this video, I wanted to pick some pretty famous examples that were verifiably crazy and also somewhat well known. However, I do have a list of over 30 other examples of people who escaped prison around the world in the most insane ways. So if you guys loved this video and would like a part 2 about more obscure and more unknown prison escapes, please let me know in the comments that you would love a part 2 to this video, and I would be more than happy to make it. Maybe if this video hits 20,000 likes, I'll make a follow-up. Your guys' support truly means a lot. Now, let's get to our third crazy prison break story. The Japanese prison break. Yoshie Shiratori is likely one of the most famous escape artists from all of Japan, and he didn't have a career in magic. He unfortunately had a life of crime. Yoshie lost his father at the age of 2, and his own mother abandoned him shortly after. And as an adolescent, he worked at a tofu shop, and then later became a fisherman catching crabs in Russia. However, after succumbing to a crippling gambling addiction, he turned to a life of crime. Throughout his crime career, Yoshie famously escaped from 4 different prisons, and I'm about to tell you about every single one of them. Yoshie was initially put behind bars in 1936 for a felony murder charge, a murder charge that is speculated to have been a false, forced confession from abusive prison guards. Regardless, Yoshie was in prison, and during this time in the early 1900s, Japanese prison was extremely harsh, and it was for that reason that people were almost left no other option than try to escape because the living conditions were simply so horrible. And Yoshie was no different. Not long after being locked up, Yoshie began studying the routines of the guards to have an understanding of their patterns so he could potentially plan an escape. And one day, while cleaning himself in the bathhouse, he found the perfect tool to escape. He took one of the metal bands off of a wash bucket in the bathhouse and brought it back to his cell, where he was able to fashion this thin, flimsy piece of metal into a makeshift lockpick. And he used this lockpick to escape. He first waited for the guards to pass by his cell, and then he put pieces of wood underneath a blanket on his bed to make it appear that he was in his cell. And then he began picking the lock directly on the front door of his cell. One of the most brazen escapes we've talked about so far in this video. After successfully picking the lock on his own cell, he was free from his cell, but still behind many other locked doors. And surprisingly, he was able to successfully lockpick through numerous other doors and successfully escape the prison and achieve freedom once again. But this is only his first escape of many, as 3 days after his initial escape, he was already back in police custody because he was found stealing supplies from a local hospital. Because of this escape and attempted theft, he was given another life sentence and transferred to a different prison. Originally, Yoshie was actually placed back in the original prison he escaped from, but during World War II in 1942, Yoshie was actually transferred to another prison, known as Akita Prison, where he found himself in harsher conditions. And the guards at this prison were very privy to his escape attempts, and they wanted to make sure that they made an example out of Yoshie. One of the additional punishments that Yoshie received at this new prison was extended solitary confinement. And these solitary confinement rooms were literally designed for escape artists. They had smooth copper walls, the ceiling was extremely high, and the only way in and out was the front door, besides a skylight that was at the very top of the very high ceiling, which obviously nobody could reach. Right? Well, almost anybody couldn't reach. Because on June 15th, in solitary confinement, Yoshie decided to escape once again. When I say Yoshie was a master escape artist, I mean it. And he was able to escape this unescapable room. And how he did it was he first got out of his handcuffs. Oh yeah, he was literally kept in handcuffs 24/7 in this new prison just because they wanted to make extra sure he would not escape. But obviously that didn't stop him. He escaped these handcuffs by finding a piece of wire once again in this solitary confinement. Where it came from, we don't know. But regardless, he used it to unpick his handcuffs. At this point, his hands were free, and he began to use his bare palms and feet to scale the sides of this extremely tall prison cell. Not only was Yoshie a master lockpicker, but he was also a very talented climber, and this came in handy here. And after a few attempts, he was able to make it to this skylight, which was sealed by metal bars and impossible to escape through, besides the fact that it had a wooden frame securing those metal bars. And that wooden frame was rotting due to its exposure to the elements. Now, Yoshie wasn't able to just break this wood frame in one go, but similar to the first story where the men broke through the concrete over time, Yoshie over time was able to pick away at the wooden window frame until he was able to escape through the roof of this unescapable room. Once Yoshie was certain that the wooden frame was brittle enough, he waited until a particularly stormy night to bust through the roof, as he assumed on a stormy night the guards would be less likely to suspect tapping on the ceiling to be footsteps and more likely to simply write them off as rain, which is exactly what he did. And it worked flawlessly. And once again, Yoshie was a free man. Now this time you must be asking yourself, okay, obviously he didn't steal again, right? He escaped prison twice, almost an impossible feat. There's no way he was going to steal again to go back to prison, right? And you're technically right, but obviously he did go back to jail because we still have 2 more escapes to talk about. And the reason he was sent back to prison is rather unique. After his 3 months of essentially homeless freedom, he decided to pay one of the head guards from Akita Prison a visit, because this head guard was one of the only ones who never beaten and abused him. The guard recognized Yoshie at his door and let him in and fed Yoshie and allowed him to tell his story. And Yoshie explained to the head guard that he was here simply to tell him his plan because he deserved to know, because he was the only one who treated Yoshie well. Yoshie explained how he wanted to go to America to raise awareness about the human rights violations that were taking place in Japanese prison, and hopefully through this awareness and a civil lawsuit be able to gain his freedom once again. And while this head guard seemed to be respectful and listening, when Yoshie went to use the washroom, this head guard unsurprisingly called the police and Yoshie was sent back to prison once again. Now this time, Yoshie requested that he at least go to a Tokyo prison where it's a bit warmer, because the first 2 prisons he had spent time in were in the northern part of Japan where it was relatively cold, which only added to the distress that he experienced within prison. However, this 3rd prison he was sent to was not in Tokyo and not in a warm climate at all. It was actually the northernmost prison in all of Japan, known as Abashiri Prison. And the guards at this prison were not messing around. At this point, they knew this man was extremely clever and not only escaped from 1 prison, but from 2, using different methods. And when they booked him into this 3rd prison, they made sure that he would never escape again. He was in a cell that only had openings that were smaller than the human body, so he could not possibly escape. He was given custom fit ankle cuffs and arm cuffs that were behind his back without keyholes, so they could not possibly be picked. And he was almost always by himself in freezing cold conditions. And on top of this, his life sentence was only extended due to his additional escape. So realistically, at this point, Yoshie had nothing to live for. His arms and legs were bound, there was absolutely no opportunity for escape, and he was alone all of the time, freezing cold and poorly treated. But somehow, Yoshie still had one more trick up his sleeve. While confined in this hellhole, Yoshi's body was basically useless, but his mind was definitely not. And what he did to escape Abashiri Prison was absolutely insane. He realized that the cell that he was being held in was made primarily of iron, and the food that he was given every single day was a very salty miso soup. And while he needed to eat as much of his food as possible to live, he always left a little bit of miso soup behind, which he would splash directly on the bolts of the observation window on the door and on the hinges of his handcuffs and ankle cuffs. And slowly, over time, the salt and oxygen exposure on this metal would slowly cause it to rust and weaken. And after 6 months of slowly deteriorating the metal that confined him, he was able to make a move. Once again, at night, he started by fully removing his leg cuffs and then his arm cuffs, and then began the true challenge. He began unbolting the observation window on the front door of his cell, but there was still one problem. Even with the observation window bars removed, the hole was still too small for the human body. Well, at least the average human body. Yoshi was, of course, a talented contortionist. Maybe because he was ultra flexible, or maybe just because he was ultra determined, he was able to dislocate his shoulders to shove his torso through this observation window and flop himself on the ground outside of his cell, almost free. He later broke through an unprotected window in the ceiling in a different part of the jail and was once again a free man. And also the first person ever to escape from Abashiri prison, one of the most brutal Japanese prisons ever. But similar to Alcatraz, the risks associated with escaping this prison weren't just within the walls. Even if you escaped this prison, you are still in an extremely remote northern part of Japan with no civilization around you, extremely cold temperatures, and on top of all of this, mountain bears. But somehow, Yoshi still survived. He ended up finding an abandoned mine shaft in one of the nearby mountains and was able to live in there alone, primarily eating nuts, berries, small animals in the area, and even crab fishing, which he reported to have learned from watching the bears do it, which is insane if true. But here's the thing, Yoshi didn't die in this mine shaft. He obviously got a bit restless and decided that it was worth risking going back into civilization and made the long trek to the nearest city, where he was surprised to see English and American soldiers and what seemed to be a huge change in the culture. And that's when he grabbed a newspaper and got caught up to date. During his 2 years spent in this abandoned mineshaft, World War II had come to a close, Japan had surrendered, and America, for the most part, had taken over the entire penitentiary system, which to Yoshi was a huge relief because he assumed at that point that there would be huge reform and at the very least, they'd be less on his case. And with this newfound information, he felt more confident to try to return to his family. But it was on this 50-day journey from where he was to his family that he found himself in trouble once again. Starving on his journey, he decided to pick some tomatoes from a tomato field that he was passing. And the farmer who owned this field just so happened to see Yoshi take these tomatoes. And this farmer mistook Yoshi for a local thief. The two ended up fighting, and the farmer ended up dying as a result of the fight. Some claims state that Yoshi killed this man accidentally, and others claim that it was legitimate self-defense. Regardless, the farmer was killed, and Yoshi, once again, was caught. But initially, they didn't even know who they had. They only thought they had a murderer, but once he was fully booked, they realized that they had the infamous escapist Yoshi Shiratori. And he was no longer sentenced to life in prison, he was sentenced to death. The year is now 1947, and Yoshi is being sent to Sapporo prison, where he will await his execution. And obviously, because Yoshi has now escaped 3 different prisons using 3 different methods and now has theft and murder under his belt, the police are taking absolutely no chances with this final cell. Yoshi is being given 24/7 surveillance, reinforced doors and bars, and any opening that leads to this room is smaller than the human head. Because no matter how good of a contortionist you are, you can't make your skull smaller. So in this situation, there is absolutely no way that Yoshi escapes, right? This is obviously where the story ends. He was obviously later executed by the Japanese government, and that's history, right? Of course not. This is Yoshi we're talking about. And interestingly, this is one of the most simple escapes he performed. Because since day 1 in this jail cell, Yoshi started playing mind games, specifically by always looking up. Yoshi, up until this point, had always escaped through the roof, and his guards knew that. And every day when the guards would check on him, Yoshi would make sure that he was looking up. And as a result, the guards were always looking up, making sure that when they would check on Yoshi, they would always check the ceiling. But this escape had nothing to do with the ceiling, and Yoshi was going in the opposite direction. Yoshi's cell was fortified on the walls, ceiling, openings, but one place that wasn't fortified was the floor. And over the course of a month, Yoshi would remove a floorboard and begin digging into the floor below his bed, in secrecy until he had a usable tunnel. And once again, one morning, the guards were unable to get a response out of Yoshi. And when they entered his cell, they realized that what was in his bed wasn't Yoshi, but once again, a pile of wood. Almost a calling card at this point. And for a year, Yoshi was on the run. And as you may or may not know, he did go back to jail one last time. But this time was different. He ended up confessing to a random police officer who decided to offer him a cigarette in public. And at this point, Yoshie could not handle the guilt, and he confessed everything to this police officer who was simply offering a gesture of kindness. But when Yoshie was tried again, things were different. The system treated him with sympathy. Reform seemed to have taken place. The murder charge he had was dropped and considered self-defense. And as a result, so was his execution. His request to go to a Tokyo prison was accepted, and his new sentence was only 20 years. 20 years which he happily served, as his prison conditions were much better. And after 14 out of those 20 years, Yoshie was paroled on good behavior, and was for the first time in a long time a truly free man. This story is insane, and I knew I had to save it for last. And while some claim parts are exaggerated, personally, I don't even care. I think it's a great story. And for that reason, Yoshie is a bit of a legend in Japan, and there are even statues up of him, which is kind of interesting. But I suppose the story is something you can learn from. Yoshie passed away in 1979 at the age of 71, but he still lives on today in folklore, stories like this, films, books, and other stuff like that. I want to think how to get rich in every time period. Not too long ago, I made a video about what it was like to be rich in every time period, and you guys really liked that video. In that video, I talked about the experiences and the lifestyle of wealthy people in every time period, and only briefly touched on how that wealth was typically acquired. But in this video, I wanted to provide some perspective on how wealth could be made and how you could get rich in every time period. Let's get started. The Stone Age. This segment is likely going to be the most wholesome on the entire list, and that's just because the Stone Age was a simpler time. Genuinely, not many things were required to be wealthy, and the concept of being rich or wealthy didn't even exist. In the Stone Age, simply surviving was hard enough. So if you miraculously survived childbirth and somehow survived the brutality of a Stone Age childhood, you were already essentially a billionaire. And everything even remotely close to wealth had to do directly with your survivability. That meant food, shelter, water, were your livelihood, and in turn, your wealth. So now that we understand that the modern concept of wealth simply doesn't apply here, what does wealth look like in the Stone Age, and how could you acquire it? Let's start from the beginning. Like I mentioned earlier, to be wealthy, you first need to be alive. And that means the basis of our wealth will be our life. And as a baby, our life is in the hands of our parents. So the original rich babies or boss babies or Nepo babies were simply kids that were lucky enough to have parents that didn't die during childbirth or didn't accidentally kill them or allow them to be killed in their likely harsh environment. Already, this is making me realize how much we take for granted. Next up, assuming your parents care about you, survived childbirth, don't plan on killing you, and are healthy, fit, and able to provide for you properly, you will be able to experience childhood the Stone Age way, which is basically just Minecraft, but not a game, just a reality. Now, assuming you survived your entire childhood and adolescence, you are now an adult in the Stone Age, on your own, looking to build wealth for yourself. And by that, I mean literally just survive. I'm really stressing this point because it is extremely important to consider that simply surviving up until this point is a major achievement, and basically the equivalent of being handed a $100 million trust fund as soon as you turn 18. But now, in this hypothetical scenario, when you are alive, healthy, and on your own, what do you do next? Unfortunately, there is no online business or jobs, and if you want something, you have to go get it. Literally. The first thing you would need to get is food, which is the first and likely primary pillar of wealth in the Stone Age, a steady supply of food. Being on land that was fertile, not only for yourself but for animals, directly impacted your likelihood of survival, and therefore, your wealth. If you lived in the right biome, nature would provide for you, as long as you were a semi-skilled hunter and in tune with your environment. However, the wrong biome would leave you starved and dehydrated in only a matter of days. This directly ties into the next pillar of wealth, which I'll combine two separate parts into one: location and shelter. Of course, food is essential for life and, in this case, wealth. But like we discussed, to have this steady source of food, you must have a conducive environment, which in itself is a form of wealth. But I kind of already made that point, so without repeating myself, let's discuss the second part of this: shelter. Depending on what part of the Stone Age we're talking about, because it does go pretty far back, a lot of shelters were more or less natural, with the most common being a cave, hence the term caveman. If you wanted to be rich, and I mean ultra rich, you lived on land that provided you food and also had shelter that was ready for you to move right in. Consider this prime real estate. This is the prehistoric equivalent of moving into a condo that has a restaurant on the main floor. It's everything you need all in one place. Well, almost everything. We're still missing an essential component, which is the third pillar, that being water. You now have your prime real estate. You have your cave. You have your wild berries growing outside your cave apartment, and you have a steady flow of cute critters that you stomp on and eat on a daily basis. But the last thing to make you a true bajillionaire is to have a steady stream of fresh water, ideally trickling right through a stream right outside of your cave. Without water, shelter and food is almost useless because you won't be around long to enjoy it. So this supply of water is the perfect trifecta for your life and, in this case, your wealth. But it's a bit boring if we end there. What's wealth without a bit of legacy? And maybe someone to share it with. Just because living was hard enough in the Stone Age doesn't mean that there wasn't additional luxuries you could indulge in. And for this example, let's pick our bonuses. I have my cave, I have my food, I have my water. What am I missing? I'd say a cave woman to spend my days with and unga bunga with at night. And with your partner by your side, you're now able to continue your legacy, have Caveman Jr., and ideally allow them to inherit your success. And by that I mean your cave doesn't get raided, the stream doesn't dry up, and the animals don't migrate elsewhere. And spoiler alert, those are all going to happen. And all of your hard work is basically null and void because everything that you had to go through to build your wealth and literally survive is going to have to be done entirely from scratch once again by your children. I think I've made it crystal clear that wealth in the Stone Age is simply being alive. So to answer the question, how do you get rich in the Stone Age? You just don't die. The Bronze Age. No, not the guy that plays for the Lakers, the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age is really a landmark in terms of human development. And as we'll see in this segment, there are many changes between humans and wealth in the Stone Age and the Bronze Age. For starters, the Bronze Age is a much more concentrated timeline. The Stone Age, for example, literally goes on for millions of years, whereas the Bronze Age is roughly 2,000 years in total. Don't allow this relatively short timeline to fool you. The amount of development that took place during this era was rapid and impactful. Some major differences right off the bat between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age is that people began to settle. In the Stone Age, a lot of people were nomadic, similar to animals, going where the resources were, as typically ideal locations didn't last very long. But with the introduction of agriculture and other advanced survival techniques, people were able to settle in locations that were deemed ideal. One major difference between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age that was spawned out of settlements were possessions. Because when you are nomadic, you're not able to carry much with you, and for that reason, you didn't own much. On the contrary, when you have a place to call your own, you're able to start collecting a thing or two. And from that, begin to store value and ultimately accumulate wealth. Besides this, we are seeing early coinage, and with this, early commerce as well, which will serve as the foundation for how we measure wealth for the rest of the video. With developed skills, new tools, larger settlements, and early coinage, it's not hard to believe that trade was essentially inevitable. What did they trade, you may ask? Well, everything, but most importantly, bronze. And although settlements and trade are developing, it doesn't necessarily mean that life was all of a sudden easy at this point. Life was still difficult, and every skill and piece of luck required to survive in the Stone Age is still required now. But for the sake of this video, we're gonna assume this is more or less of a given, so we can focus on the specifics of what made you rich in the Bronze Age. Like we mentioned in the last video, during the Bronze Age, wealth began to be associated with the control and production of bronze, which is a valuable metal that is made from copper and tin. Being rich meant you had access to metal ores and the knowledge required to craft tools, weapons, and ornaments, which were things that everybody needed. Maybe not the ornaments, but tools and weapons definitely. Like I mentioned, with settlements growing, trade became more prominent, both inside of settlements and also between settlements via established trade routes. And if you were someone who was able to take advantage of these trade routes, you could significantly enhance your wealth. Besides commerce, another way to gain money and power was through social status, which started to become more of an important thing during this time period. During this time, chiefs and leaders would amass their wealth through the people that they ruled, whether they had full control over the tribe's resources or they simply took contributions from each of their people. Now that we have a bit more context on the Bronze Age and what exactly wealth looked like in the Bronze Age, how could you get rich? For the sake of simplicity, let's assume that you had a great upbringing. Your parents were alive and you survived, and now you're 18 years old looking to build your life and become wealthy in the Bronze Age. Like I mentioned, you ultimately have two primary options. One is to become a merchant, or two, become a leader. We'll touch on both of these. Starting with becoming a merchant, the control and manufacturing of copper was a booming industry. So if I were planning to get rich, I would definitely start there. The first thing I would do is start looking for copper. I would make my wood and maybe even stone pickaxe and get straight to the mines, looking for any copper deposits I could find. Now, this isn't obviously the only way you could gain wealth. I think a better way to gain wealth in the Bronze Age is to become an artisan, specifically making the best type of either tool, weapon, or ornament. For this example, let's say that we want to make the best sword possible. In this case, I would go to a blacksmith and immediately beg them for their knowledge. I don't care if I was unpaid. I don't care if I was like SpongeBob with the Krusty Krab and I had to pay to work there. I would be getting my hours in at the blacksmith so I could hone in my skills on making the best swords possible. Why would I do that? Well, if I could make the best swords and gain a reputation as the guy who makes the best swords, which would hopefully be my official title, I would hope to potentially make a name for myself and ideally catch the attention of the powers that be. Because you know who needs swords? The troops. And you know who wants their troops to win battles? Leaders. And you know who has all of the money? Also leaders. for the most part. I think you see where I'm going here. That's just one example, but if you were doing anything valuable related to copper, chances are you were able to make a few shillings for yourself. But let's just say for this example, you weren't very inclined to mine or craft. And in that example, I would recommend you go the route of leadership. How would I go about that? I would first identify the powers at be. You could try to assassinate him and hopefully fill the power vacuum, but I think that the likelihood of that working out are low. This would definitely be a slow grind, but if you're willing to put in the time and you're charismatic enough, I think it could work. I would get as close as possible as I could to the leader, maybe potentially offering to be some sort of servant. At this point, I would do my absolute best to gain their trust, gain their respect, and ideally become someone that they consider to be a friend. Through this relationship, I would prove that my ideas were worthy and that I potentially had the skills to be a leader, without ever, of course, showing up the leader himself. At this point, over time, I would wait for opportunities to arise where I could potentially fill voids where leadership was needed or ideas were required. And hopefully, through my connection to the actual leader, I could become a person of power myself and benefiting from that sweet, sweet Bronze Age nepotism. Now, in reality, were people in the Bronze Age really so entrepreneurial focused or status focused that they'd be willing to cozy up to the king? I think potentially. And people like this definitely existed, but they weren't the norm. Most people were just trying to exist. And serfdom was basically hard labor all day to feed yourself and your family and potentially make a few dollars on the side, or simply to do your duties for the village that you lived in to make sure that you had the protection that they'd offered you. So to answer the question of how do you get rich in the Bronze Age, I'd say your best bet is to get involved in the bronze industry in any way that you think you would excel the most. In my example, I wanted to master blacksmithing swords and use this to my advantage to essentially get government contracts, or at the very least, sell desirable artisan swords to rich merchants and political leaders, and ultimately get that bag. The Iron Age. What a time to be alive. During the Bronze Age, we experienced more development in 2,000 years than we did during the over 3 million years of human existence in the Stone Age. Due to this exponential growth, you would likely assume that this trend continued into the Iron Age, but that's not exactly the case. Like we mentioned in the previous video, the end of the Bronze Age was a rather rough time, and due to major situations that happened, which are honestly worthy of their own video, most of the world was left in a place where production, trade routes, literacy, and overall progress were either diminished or reduced, making the Bronze Age more or less of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back sort of situation. That being said, it's not all doom and gloom because we're humans and we're chads, and we ultimately figured it out. Obviously, just look at us now. But that leads us to the beginning of the Iron Age. We needed to rebuild, and we needed to do it now. The beginning of the Iron Age was very similar to the beginning of the Bronze Age, with the primary difference, of course, being the metal at play, which, you guessed it, was iron. Iron wasn't necessarily a stronger material, but it was more readily available and it was easier to produce, which helped facilitate a lot of progress. Which is why, if you're paying attention to the dates, you'll notice that the Iron Age was also much shorter than the Bronze Age, and the Bronze Age was much shorter than the Stone Age. The exponential growth is still continuing even after the bump in the road. Now, that's a nice underdog story and all, but how do we get rich? Like I mentioned in the last video, being rich in the Iron Age was not very different than being rich in the Bronze Age. And I hate to break it to you, getting rich in the Iron Age also wasn't very different than getting rich in the Bronze Age. But I'll still give you a new hypothetical in this new time period. Let's assume that once again, you're a healthy, able-bodied, 18-year-old ready to start your life. The artisan sword company that your parents had founded has now gone Bronze Age bankrupt and they are dead. For the sake of this story, they just died too. They went broke and died. So now you're here, alone, looking to get that bag in the Iron Age. What do? Once again, you have 2 options. Get involved in emerging industries, in this case, the production of iron, or try to get as cozy as possible with the powers that be, which at this point in time isn't an easy task. So in this case, I'm becoming an iron mogul. With establishments growing and jobs becoming more or less of a thing, my plan is to find and own the best iron deposit my settlement and likely other settlements have ever seen. But here's the thing, if I'm just one guy looking around for iron deposits, I may not be that successful, and I may miss things. And even once I do find it, there's a lot of work to be done there. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'll need help. First thing I'll do is go to the nearest farm. I'm gonna try to round up as many farmers that I can find who are no longer interested in farming and looking for a better opportunity. At this point, everyone's been seeing the new and shiny iron tools and they know that they're expensive. And likely, they're interested and want their own. And my proposal to them would be, join my team, help me find an iron deposit, let's mine it together, and with you, I will share the rewards. Realistically, the proposal is no money up front, but a lot of money down the line if you're willing to work with me. And once I have a good group of guys, we're ready to go. Day 1, we're looking, searching, scoundering, floundering, sleuthing, anything we can do to find iron deposits. Once this has been achieved, we begin the hard work. mining. We gather as much as we can and determine how good this vein of iron really is. And if we see potential, we set up camp. Once we begin mining, we begin either collaborating with an existing manufacturing facility, or we build our own to be able to turn the raw materials into a usable iron to make tools, weapons, and once again, ornaments. Once we get a more refined process, we then begin to stockpile and finally sell our refined material. We could sell the raw material, but we also know that if we sell a more refined material, we can get more money. And from that point, we begin our journey. All of the men that were mining are now selling. Door to door, potentially. We are going to every blacksmith and offering them the best iron in the best condition with minimal work on their end. Just heat it and forge it. What more could you want? Ideally, once again, the leaders at B take notice and want to buy my iron, but I'm happy if even just the blacksmiths prefer mine. At this point, we begin to collect money and it's a beautiful system. In the Bronze Age, I wanted to make the swords, and in the Iron Age, I was the person selling the materials to those artisans. Is this a realistic plan? I highly doubt it. This oversimplified, trust me bro hypothetical is leaving out so many components. Specifically, all of the violence that would have potentially taken place either between my team, between settlements, between people in my settlement that wanted my iron deposits, and so many other things that could have potentially existed. I'm just now realizing that this video is basically what it was like to be an entrepreneur in every time period, which I guess makes sense because entrepreneurship and wealth typically go hand in hand. The medieval era. Now things are really heating up and we are in full swing of development. People are settled and civilization is making major strides. There is a very established class system and money is more important than ever. The richest people in the medieval era were the people that were closest to the powers that be, those being the nobility and the merchants that were able to sell products over very long distances. Both of these were extremely useful to the king and therefore paid very nicely. And considering the major wealth gap in the huge centralization of money and power, your best bet was to get money from the king, because most other people just didn't have it. During this time, spices, precious metals, and silk were extremely desirable materials, and I'm going to use those to my advantage once we get to the hypothetical. For my plan to get rich in the medieval era, I want to do something different. I'm done being an entrepreneur. I want to now become a criminal. And for this reason, I'll need to target merchants. You see, the nobility had most of their wealth come from the land that they owned, which was given to them from the monarch. And it's rather hard to steal land, at least not without a fight. So I think I'm better off stealing from the long distance merchants. In this time period, I am more motivated than ever to get my bag up because we are starting to see the early equivalent of modern luxuries. Large, beautiful castles, servants, comfy clothes, something that kind of resembles a toilet, concubines, jewel-encrusted stuff, and other fun stuff like that. So yeah, let's get rich. Although my plan may seem simple, with nations developing and with power becoming centralized, I am at greater risk than ever of being reprimanded for the crimes I'm about to commit. Because now there is rule, there is order, and I need to be very careful about how I go about breaking it. I'll start my journey once again like every other journey as an 18-year-old looking to build my life. Let's say that I was born into an established kingdom, into a regular poor family. My goal is to become a known member of society and a positive one at that. I want to be active in the church, helping those in need, and seen often within the community. But this will work in my favor for my malicious intention. My goal is to gain the trust specifically of the rich merchants doing long distance trade, because they 1, have the most money, and 2, are the most vulnerable. See, being a thief, I could try to pickpocket around my city, but eventually it's gonna catch up to me. And honestly, there's a cap to how much money I can make. Back to my trust with the merchants. My goal is for them to feel comfortable sharing their information with me, specifically when trade shipments are going out, what the shipments are, and where they are going to be. For example, imagine I just go around the city with a broom every so often, just out of my goodwill, but I always somehow happen to broom where the rich merchants are. This isn't by accident. I want to overhear them, and ideally, I want to gain information. If I'm sweeping right beside 2 rich merchants having a discussion outside and I overhear one of them telling the other one that they had a large shipment of spices just get delivered and they are currently days away from getting their large payment, I'm going to inquire. I may ask this merchant how the shipment went and where they shipped it and where they even got the spices. I'm going to pretend like I'm interested in the business, when in reality, I just want to know when's that money coming into town and what route is it going to take. Let's just assume that this merchant slips up and he accidentally tells me that his people always come in the back route to the kingdom and they always head home under the veil of night. At that point, I have all of the information I need. I will go about my day, and as soon as the sun starts to set, I will put on my dark cloak and begin my journey. I will begin my trek on the back trail, getting outside of the kingdom and closer to my reward. I'll likely go 10, 20, 30, maybe even 40 kilometers on the trail. Something far enough from my kingdom so nobody knows what's going on, but still not too far that I can't do it in one night. I have 2 options. I can either hide and sneak attack these people on the way back, or I could gain their attention in other ways. For this example, my strategy is tricking the merchants into stopping and thinking that I need help. I brought a second robe with me and I folded it in a way that made it look like it was a swaddled baby. I'm going to be sitting in the middle of the trail holding my baby, rocking back and forth, hysterically waiting for them. Once they arrive, I'm going to beg them for their help and tell them that they need to help save my baby. I am going to be inconsolable and overwhelming to them. They're going to want to leave me immediately. Unfortunately, I don't need much time to distract them. Because the merchant didn't tell me who was carrying the gold and where it was held, pickpocketing here is useless, and my only option is to kill them. Because I have the agility and sword skills of an absolute ninja, I flawlessly cut them all in half and they die instantly. And with my expertly placed slices, the bag of gold and silver instantly reveals itself to me. I grab the loot, leave the men, and head back into my kingdom. I arrive the same night I left, I put my robe away, and in the morning, I start the nice side of my double life. Here's the problem with this situation. If money is going missing all the time and I, a poor person, all of a sudden becomes rich, people are gonna ask questions. So I can't really spend my money, but that's okay. Because once I'm satisfied with the amount of money I have, I can leave my settlement and begin a new life. If I can travel far enough and go to places where I've never been heard of, which is likely the case if I'm just a locally known, gentle, poor person, in any new settlement I go to, I can tell them a rather convincing story that I am a wealthy merchant who was ran out of town by a bad gang and I'm just looking to have a peaceful life somewhere nice. Is this a likely or potentially even realistic situation? I highly doubt it, once again, but I think it's an actually pretty funny hypothetical of one way a rather evil person could get rich in the medieval era. And honestly, I would bet money that something like this happened at least once, and was probably more common than we think. Violence was common, robbery was everywhere, law only really existed inside of castle walls, and people were brutal. So to answer your question, how do you get rich in the medieval era? Well, there's plenty of ways, but if you're not born into money and you're not willing to put in the effort to become a successful merchant, I'd say your best bet is to go all Assassin's Creed and become the best thief you can absolutely be. The early modern era. At this point, we've gone through millions of years of history, and the early modern era is our last stop before the modern day. And the early modern era, although relatively short, is one of the most influential eras of all time, and is where we see the foundation set for the modern world that we live in today. In good ways and bad ways too. In the early modern era, wealth was driven by exploration, trade, and colonization. Nations and individuals who invested in voyages reaped enormous profits from new trade routes and new resources. Merchants are richer than ever, and now the early versions of bankers are also accumulating wealth through the emerging global trade. Like almost every other time period, owning land and engaging in agriculture is still extremely important. But with the continued growth of commerce, finance, and manufacturing, more and more opportunities are beginning to present themselves to, once again, get that bag. So we're in the early modern era. How are we gonna get rich? Well, we have two new options, exploration and colonization. And for the sake of my reputation, let's go with exploration. My goal as an explorer is going to be to build the absolute best team of cartographers, navigators, researchers, and writers, so I can not only establish new trade routes, but also make extra money by developing maps and documenting what I'm seeing on my journeys. Because during this point in time, a lot of the world was unmapped and undiscovered, at least to some people. I guess my first step would be to beg the king for a boat and a small loan. This won't be easy, but I'll tell him that I have the best cartographers, the best writers, the best captains, and the best people on my team to make sure that our voyages not only find new lands, but bring back artifacts, establish trade routes with the people that are there, if any, and that the places that we go are documented not only in map form, but in the written word. And if that doesn't convince the king for him to fund my journey, I don't know what will. So in this case, assuming he does, I now have a boat and a small loan of money. But there's one problem. All of those people that I told the king I had on my team, I don't have on my team. And I don't even have a team. So now I gotta get them. And during this time period, where do you think the best and the brightest would be? Do you think they would be the guy sitting on the side of the road, drinking wine and ale? Likely not. They're likely in the government where I just got the boat and the loan. Now, of course, I can't ask the king for these people because then he'll know I'm lying. So I have to be a bit more creative. What I'm going to do is I'm going to identify the key players in the government, specifically for captains and cartographers, and I'm gonna go to them and tell them, hey, the king gave me a loan, a boat, and he told me that you have to come with me. Now, of course, he could verify this with the king, unless I told him a reason not to. I'm gonna tell these people that the king is mad at them. And I don't know why, but the king said that if he saw them again, he was going to have them executed. And for that reason, these people should come on this adventure with me. Not only to get out of the king's sight for a bit, but also to get back in the king's good graces. This may seem manipulative, and you're 100% right, but it's also, in this situation, my only option. And now, my house of cards is finally complete, and together, we set sail. On this boat, boat, I am more or less useless. So I am trusting the captain and the cartographer with this entire operation essentially. Fortunately, a lot of areas are simply unmapped. So I just tell the cartographer to tell the captain to go where we haven't gone before. At least where we don't have recorded evidence of going. And from that point, we're off. Even at this point in the story, we've done so much and risked so much just to even get here, and we haven't even made $1 yet, and we are still relatively poor. We have a loaned out ship, a team of people that we're deceiving, and debt to the government in the form of the loan. And if we're unable to find anything of substance, we're cooked. And my elaborate ruse is over. But because everything has kind of perfectly fallen into place in the story, let's continue that trend. And let's say on our first voyage, we discover the most amazing thing ever. What is it, you may ask? It's a remote, abandoned island where the richest pirate gangs hid all of their most valuable loot, including coins, artifacts, booty, and slightly used peg legs. At this point, I need to come clean. I tell the guys, hey, you guys are all being lied to, and if you don't continue the lie with me, then we're all gonna die. The men agree, we get the loot, we go back home, and we do it again and again. And we all live happily ever after. That's just one hypothetical about how you could use exploration to your advantage to get rich in the early modern era. And in case you wanted to learn about how to use colonization to get rich, well, just read a history book. The modern era. Wow, guys, can't you believe it? I've been able to cover millions of years of history, and somehow I've made no mistakes and left out no information. Everything I've said has been completely accurate and not totally oversimplified, glossed over, uninformed, and almost entirely hypothetical. That's crazy. But now, here we are in the modern day. A time period you may be familiar with. I don't think I need to explain too much about what being rich in the present day looks like, but I'll give a quick example. If you want a negative example, I recommend going to our channel and watching this video about rich weirdos. But if you want some positive examples, rich people just like cool stuff. Big houses, big boats, fast cars. And if you're really rich, space travel and goth girlfriends. Now, getting into how you can get rich in the present day, the opportunities are honestly endless. If you're currently watching this looking for a way to get rich, I'm gonna give you a foolproof plan to make more money than you could ever even imagine. The first thing you're going to want to do is grow your hair. Get it as long as possible. The next step is to grow facial hair and get tattoos. This will come in handy. After this, you need to establish a wardrobe of white t-shirts and basketball shorts. And once you have the look, you can begin the work. I need you to every single day begin posting on YouTube. Talk about stuff. Talk about stuff you like. Talk about stuff you don't like. Talk about that time you were almost in a movie. Talk about anything. Over time, people are going to respect you, idolize you, love you, and ultimately need your opinion for just about anything. And people are gonna eat this up. And advertisers are gonna wanna sponsor you and put their ads on your video, making you rich. Oh, and now that you have the system of getting rich and the look, you're probably gonna need a name. How about Dry Ineffective or Polar Bear 1? Something along those lines. You guys pick. But in case that's not replicatable for you guys, here's another great idea on how to get rich in the present day. Step 1 is be born into a family where your parents see you more as an opportunity to make money than their flesh and blood. At that point, have parents that create a toy channel based around you. After a few videos of you opening toys that you're excited about, your parents will begin raking in the money. And as you grow up, you'll be like, huh, I had a weird childhood, but my parents are rich. And I think I have money, maybe. And later down the line, we'll see what happens. So yeah, 2 extremely replicatable and honestly foolproof plans on how to get rich in the present day. And ladies and gentlemen, there you have it.